at 87 diseased men, and which were tested positive for anabolic steroids. And what they found, they had great cardiac mass comparing to other kind of men if they adjusted all other factors. And also there is ventricular hypertrophy, fibrosis, and myocyte lysis in cardiac death in anabolic steroids. What about radiological studies? So this is in living people who are actually using anabolic steroids compared to those non-users. There is definitely decreased ventricular ejection fractions, reduced diastolic tissue velocities, and one study is demonstrated specifically decreased aortic elasticity, and I'm going to discuss this later on. Again, there is also coronary artery calcium scores higher based on the also radiological studies compared to men at a comparable age, which again put them at risk of atherosclerosis and MIs compared to normal populations. What about human growth factors? Isn't it that if you grow better, bigger, it's going to be better? I don't think so. So it's actually little known specifically about the cardiovascular effects, but if you see the acromegaly patients who have actually excess, like if you just extrapolate the results of acromegaly patients, they have hypertension, congestive cardiac failure, and cardiomyopathy. So you can guess if they have excess growth hormone, definitely risk of cardiovascular is there. Beta-alanine supplements is one of the commonly used now between athletes and non-athletes due to the illegality of anabolic steroids. Actually, it's found in 60% of sport codes because now it's self-reported because it's actually not a ban product. And what do we know about the supplement itself? Is it really toxic? Studies of adverse effects itself is not really there because we need time in order to see the long-term health effects with these supplements, but neurotoxicity, respiratory distress, myotonia is all seen in humans who have excess beta-alanine in metabolic cases specifically. So again, if you extrapolate the results, you could expect some effect to be there. And this is also one study done in Tour de France cyclist events, which is a common cyclist event done. Actually, the first cardiac death happened in this event. It was back in the 1960s, but this study specifically checked between 2 years, like 1995, the blue one, and then 1999, and they were checking their ejection fraction and cardiac mass by echo, and they noted that their heart is becoming bigger as the year go, and they're actually their function or ejection fraction is becoming less. And at this specific year, the use of performance-enhancing supplement was becoming very popular. So that's one thing to be put in mind. Animal studies also have demonstrated some bad effects of clenbuterol. So there was increased atrial and ventricular size and increased aortic root again, and kind of decrease in the elasticity, and they notice actually sudden death in horses. So this is experimental study done in horses, and the poor horses end up dying from aortic rupture. There are other modulators or androgen receptor modulator, and the reason why these substances came in because androgen steroids were becoming illegal, so they were trying to bypass detection, so they brought these receptor modulator. Common example is thiomycin beta 4, and they dissociate the androgen and anabolic effects, making them undetectable. Still, very little is known about their cardiovascular risk, but if you just think about it, if they are going to be acting on the same receptors, probably effect is going to be there. We just need to wait and see the effect. And the end results for some of these people, so if they did not die, some of them, they may end up having really very bad cardiomyopathy. And the example is the patient I saw. He was huge, young, but cannot even walk without assistance. He will probably need eventually a heart transplant. His heart is big and not working well. And some of these people walk around with their external ventricular device, assessing them in their daily lives. So in summary, it's actually a very common use in young, and this is even in my country, leave alone other countries, and even in US it have been reported. There are many types, and unfortunately the young generation, they don't even know what they are using. They just want the quickest way to look fit, big, and lean, regardless of what will happen next, and this is really striking and frightening. And there is no awareness of adverse effects And there is no even increase kind of public education regarding this because it's having lots of opposed action from the companies who are making them. Actually, what I came to know that trainers in the gym, they get some sort of commission and advantage the more they sell these products. So it's a kind of a revenue and big business. So it's going to be hard to actually oppose business. And lack of regulation and proper control. A lot of these are regulated in the sport activity scenes, but in public there is no proper actually control. People can access whatever they want, and there is no shop, no place now where they don't have the supplements displayed there without a proper warning. And definitely cardiac toxicity does exist, including sudden death or long-term cardiac diseases. That's all about my presentation. These are my list of references, and keep calm and call toxicologists. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for 2 questions, I think.
Any questions? Yes.
Please.
Yes. That's striking?
Maybe not. Supplements, is it like multivitamins? Is it on?
So supplements, no, so supplements, what we specifically meant supplements in the gym. So it's not, they were not talking about vitamins. And even majority of them, they don't even know. They are just buying supplements to enhance their performance and gaining more muscles, but they have no idea what supplements they use. Some of them, they were actually not kind of keen to give us the informations because they were afraid that some illegal actions will be taken about. But I knew, like from my own sources in the gym, they are injectable, like some of these supplements come injectable, and most probably they are steroids.
Is it the time now that there should be some regulations for any gym to be open?
Absolutely.
Yes.
To have a specific recommendation
Absolutely.
to be assigned to a physician, a doctor, and maybe not to leave it like this.
Absolutely, and this is what I'm trying to do, because the first thing you need to prove that problem exists, and you have to submit the data. So what I did only a pilot study in Muscat. Now I'm planning to extend my study to include all the country and just to screen what's going on there. And I'm trying to get more information to actually submit it. Huh? Oh, great. And the thing is, the problem is, what I noticed, lots of opposition from the gym themselves to participate in the studies, because again, it's a money-making revenue for them. Like the more they provide supplements, the more they get money, and they try to convince people who are there to actually, and you know what's striking, which I did not mention, many of these actually users are undergrad. They're too young even to be knowledgeable to know or decide. They're undergrad. They're not even like, they just either finished their secondary school, they're just in college, so they don't even have the full potential to understand the consequences. They just want to look good, no matter how they will end up.
I have one question. In your country, is it easy to buy on internet, or there is?
Yeah, this is another thing which in US probably it's very easy to get things through the internet.
Yeah.
Well, we don't need to bring it through the internet.
Exactly.
A lot of people smuggle things through the borders, and it can get access easily.
Okay.
So they don't need to order it through the internet, so they can get it delivered to them in the gym. And as a toxicologist, I'm telling you, most of what I see as overdoses cases, when I ask them where are the sources you get your drugs, it's the gym. Like they have a connection, they can get things easily.
It's the same on Italy.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's easy. There are a lot of shopping centers.
Yeah. Vitamin shop called.
Like there are so many gym there, but probably only 2 are certified for selling specific products. The rest are just on their own, unfortunately. Yes.
Please.
So I'm curious, with these drug users, are they doing injections?
Yeah,
IV
this is what I try to get. So even when we went to the questions, is it orally or injectable? Nobody want to answer the injectable ones, because the moment you say injectable, it's actually most probably anabolic steroids. So I had hard time getting any of the these answers, but they were answering we were taking supplements. So I have to go again and review my data with the members who were with me, and then actually when they question, without them, they said, we are not going to write, we are taking injections, because they are so scared to actually declare this information.
So my question for injection drug users, does Oman have resources for harm reduction to prevent transmission of diseases? And
Actually, illegal, so injectable supplements are illegal in the country. They are not supposed to come there. But again, we are talking about getting it in an illegal way, and still they are using it the way they use IV drug. It's illegal. I mean, IV drug abusers, they use IV, right? It's illegal, but still people can get access to.
Sure,
So you are talking about infection risk the same way that it's existing. But how to monitor it, how to report it, that's the challenge.
Understood, but are there practices in Oman to provide people clean needles and teach them how to prevent?
Oh, no, they are so meticulous now about actually getting their own needles for injections. So risk of infection probably is less. So they get a one-time loaded syringe, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you. I think we can
Okay.
go to the coffee break.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all the speakers.
Audience to join us. So we're going to start this afternoon session on clinical research in emergency medicine. Our first speaker is a regular Manitox presenter and well-loved. Dr. Lisa Marina Walton is a professor of EM at Louisiana State University, president of the American Academy of Emergency Medicine. Besides having an MD, she also has a master's in clinical research. Lisa has numerous research grants, over 350 national and international research presentations, and now she's going to speak to us about emergency medicine research.
Thank you. Okay, I don't have a microphone, but I don't think you'll have trouble hearing me. It's kind of a small room, and I've got a big mouth from the South Bronx. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to conduct research in the emergency department with somewhat of a focus on toxicology. The clicker is not working. Can you plug it in? Give me something that works. This doesn't work. Okay, good. All right, so we're going to talk about what research is. So I like to use the NIH definition of research. It is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So there's a little bit of a problem sometimes with generalizable knowledge, as we saw with the panel discussion last time. Generalizable, it doesn't always work, especially in toxicology, right? Snakes are not the same in every country. I think they can hear me, thanks. Envenomations are different. Poisons are different. You see a lot of organophosphate poisoning in Eastern countries. You don't see it as much in the US and Canada. So generalizable knowledge can be a problem, but certainly doing a systematic investigation that is well designed and develops knowledge is critically important. So how does good research start? Good research, I always like to say, starts with a good doctor. So you're a good doctor, you're in the emergency department, you're doing your toxicology consults, and you start to think about why do we do things the way we do them, why do diagnoses present with certain symptoms, what resources do we need to give better patient care, especially important in toxicology with antidotes and antivenoms, and can teaching be enhanced? I notice that patients do better when I do X. So all of these things can help you to develop your research question, and then you have to pass certain tests, right? Now there are a whole lot of tests that people use to say, is this going to be a publishable project? Is this going to be something that I can do? And I'm going to go through these one by one. These are the ones that I use. So who cares? So a common question is, you may be passionate about something, but other people might not. But everybody is passionate about teaching. But there is a certain problem that I see all of the time with junior investigators, and that is people who are teaching in a clinical setting devise some sort of a want to publish it, so they say, well, we're going to find out whether people know more after they use my curriculum and whether they're more comfortable doing this procedure or engaging in this particular patients with this particular diagnosis. So I'm going to steal a quote from Michelle Byros, and Professor Byros was the editor of Academic Emergency Medicine for a number of years, and she said, look, medical students and residents are intelligent people. If you teach them something, they'll learn. And if you let somebody do something, they're going to be more comfortable with it. So this is not the kind of a thing that anybody cares about. This is an example of something that somebody's going to say, we know the conclusion before you did the study. So what else can you do? What can you do instead? There are plenty of venues, online and otherwise, in which you can actually publish in a teaching journal your curriculum. And then what are the kinds of things that people do care about? Can you put a certain twist on it? For example, instead of using faculty, can you have senior residents teaching juniors or residents teaching medical students? Do you use simulation in a way that's never been used before, such as disaster? Instead of doing a tabletop exercise, can you do a simulation exercise? Think about what's important in learning. Right now, we're focusing on retention. There's been a lot of studies in resuscitation that shows that we teach people how to do CPR, and they don't know how to do it properly. And 3 months later, even, they've forgotten about the rate of compressions or the depth of compression. So does your method have something that makes it more retainable? So 3 months you can follow up, 6 months you can follow up. And some of this can be done with toxicology as well, because a lot of toxicology patients require resuscitation. So you can think about doing some of those teaching studies. Ethical. Studies have to be ethical. So to me, one of the most impactful studies, and it's because I do a lot of work in diversity and cultural competency, and so I actually love this study, but it's one of the most unethical studies that ever was performed, not in a horrible way like Tuskegee, but in a way that, clearly involved lying. So this study, Jacobson and Rosenthal were two social psychologists, and they wanted to see what the impact of what was not then called implicit bias, but is implicit bias, actually was. And so people took the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test in the United States, and they took the boy and the girl in each class who were the most average students in existence. And they went and they told the teacher, these kids in your class are absolutely phenomenally brilliant. There's nobody smarter than them. They are going to be the gems of your teaching career. They are just going to shine. And by the end of the year, the school year, what happened was those children who were boring average kids with average intelligence, got straight A's, were reading 4 years above their reading level, were performing on math tests a minimum of 4 years above. And why? Because it was the expectancy effect. So what I expect from people is what I get. This is really important in my teaching on diversity and cultural competency, because we have implicit biases based on what people look like, what we think they're going to act like, and who they're going to be. But this involved a lot. So this was not an ethical study, and it would never get through the hierarchy now. But you can do certain studies when you want to see the impact of people's behavior, or you want to see the impact of certain interventions, and it's unethical to obviously lie to your patients or lie to physicians. So you could do retrospective studies that give you information that you can't ethically get prospectively. You can look at variables that impacted patients with good outcomes and poor outcomes. For example, we know, and this is relevant to disparities, we know that if you are black in the United States and you have peripheral vascular disease, you're going to get an amputation. And if you're white in the United States and you have peripheral vascular disease, you're going to get revascularization. So how do we know this? We don't do a prospective study, but we look back at the data and we see how people are treated. So how about in toxicology? If you live in a certain country, are you less likely to survive a particular overdose because resources are not available? If you live in a rural area of that same country, are you less likely to survive an envenomation or an don't have the data available, or you don't have an electronic medical record. If we can query an electronic medical record and say, I want to look at every single patient who came in with an organophosphate poisoning in the past 10 years. I can look through my EMR and look at my ICD-10 code and find that out. But what if you can't do that? What can you do instead? Well, you could try a questionnaire asking patients if they would share information that you don't What do you notice about patients who do well and patients who don't? And study that variable. Talk to your basic science colleagues. They have access to some of these tests that you don't have access to in ED. And instead of writing a grant and trying to get money so that you can run the test, talk to a colleague in basic science who also wants to publish and likely has the assays and can run those tests with you. Can you devise an intervention that can fix a problem? Okay, so this was another study that I did where I looked at whether giving pregnant patients counseling by a midwife while they're waiting in the waiting room of the clinic, will they then take their prenatal vitamins? What kind of counseling can you do around toxicologic issues? What about legality? What if you did a counseling program in a clinic or at a school about the dangers of vaping? Would that have an impact on children's knowledge and children's practice with regard to vaping? Have education about medication storage that's done at a hospital, at a public library. Can that have an impact on the number of little kids that are getting a hold of grandma and grandpa's medication and overdosing? So you have to think about whether you have enough time to do some of these studies. You have to think about whether you have enough patients to do some of the studies, because we all know, right, that your numerator has to be the patients that actually have the disease over your denominator, which are all comers with a chief complaint. So can you get enough patients? Do you have enough money? Money is a big problem for doing studies too. How do you fix those? How are these problems solved? Large databases can address all the not enoughs. Not enough time, not enough money, not enough patients. You can find them in the large databases that I gave you. So you can learn by querying your EMR if you have one, or you can collaborate with colleagues in another country, another hospital, another organization that have access to large databases or have EMRs like CERN. You can set up randomized controlled clinical trials on your own, right? So randomization is done by computers, and it's done very, very cheaply, right? You just have to have it costs me $85 a year through my medical school to buy SAS, and that can randomize my patients. Your controls, you guys know enough about that. You have the control group is not exposed to the variable. The experimental group is exposed. In medical toxicology, you can look at that with antidotes and antigens. And you can do it in a very ethical way. You can pick two venues, one which has the antidote and one which doesn't. And your big question, therapeutic dose versus toxic dose and drug safety. So I'm not going to go into those since my time is running out. But controlled trials without randomization are another step. Anti-spectrum, meaning what happened before the intervention, what happened after. So what was going on before I had the antidote in my hospital and what goes on afterwards? Prove the effectiveness to your government, to your hospital, of actually stopping an antidote. Intervention impact studies, right? What kind of counseling programs can you, we did this a lot with HIV in the United States, what kind of counseling programs can you put in place that will have an impact on people's behavior, and then you'll see less of that disease coming into the emergency department. You can do that, again, with medication safety. You can do that with vaping. You can do that with a lot of exposures that are
1 minute.
And those 20 countries are not vegans, right? I just gave you the list. Other than Brazil, China, and India, there are no countries outside of predominantly white Christian nations that are putting out research. You need to put out research because what happens in this part of the world is not what happens in other parts of the world. The way that first world countries respond to interventions is not the way that developing countries do. So I hope I've convinced you that it is important for you to do research. And I hope I've given you some ideas as to how you can more effectively do research on a budget with the resources that you have. Menatox is leading the challenge. You have a lot of people here that are willing to help you. I'm one of them. So use your resources and let's see a whole lot of research come out of this area. And we want to be publishing it in MedJet and presenting it at AAF. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have no conflict of interest to declare. I'll go through telehealth throughout history. Surprisingly enough, the first time that telehealth was used was in 1878. So basically there was just phone calls. They would call a physician, they would take symptoms of the patient, and that significantly decreased physician visits to patient homes. Okay. So that was published in The Lancet in 1878. This image that you see here is basically the first documentation of the term telemedicine. So they talked about how they have telephotography, so now they need to have telemedicine. This was in 1927. Obviously at that time everyone thought this guy was crazy, but now it's actually happening. After that we started having satellites, and with satellites came remote monitoring. NASA started using the satellite technology to monitor the physiological measures of astronauts in space. Now that same technology, the image you see here, that's the ATS satellite in NASA. This was in the late 60s. They started using the same technology they used for the astronauts. The image you see there is a 1985 earthquake in Mexico. That technology was combined with the 1985 earthquake in Mexico to help people with telecommunication and aid in the relief support during that earthquake. And that was the first time that telehealth or telemedicine at that point in time was used in a mass casualty incident. Present day, this is present day, the image you see here. This is our Incident Command Center in the Ministry of Health. As you can see, there are tons of screens. All these screens are part of a completely integrated telehealth system. They're connected to all the hospital incident command systems and to the ambulances. So you can see exactly what's going on just by sitting in one room. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So why am I talking about telehealth? Because the current management of any disaster scenario or a mass casualty incident, it has holes. What telehealth does is fill in the cracks. The cracks that we currently have in our management, telehealth fixes them. So this is the systems that we currently have in Kuwait. It kind of matches the majority of international systems. You call 112. 112, the call is dispatched to the EOC, which is the Emergency Operations Command. Then they will activate the HICS, which is the Hospital Incident Command System, which then activates the ICS, or they can directly activate the ICS, and the ICS can activate the HICS according to the scenario. So, sit, close your eyes for like 20 seconds, a little medical meditation. Imagine that you're receiving multiple calls in a metro station, and they're telling you there are tons of patients, they all have shortness of breath, they're all vomiting. What do we do? Most of these patients seem like they're going to be tagged red. What happens currently without telehealth? Imagine that scenario, and I'll go through the scenario with what happens with telehealth. This image is basically the sarin attacks that happened in the metro station in Tokyo. So this scenario that I'm running through is similar to those. What's going to happen? Step one, you're going to get a dispatch of ambulances. These are ICU ambulances. All the monitors you have here are also integrated in the telehealth system. You can get ultrasounds that can be integrated in the telehealth system. So basically, it's complete. You can re-triage, you can manage your patient through the ambulance. This is another option that you have in case it's needed. This is the HEMS. So the Hospital Emergency Medical Services or the Air Medical Services, they can also be activated as necessary. So this is basically dispatch. Now, what happens on scene? This is on scene. This was a triage scenario that we did, an MCI scenario that we did. You're going to see patients. They're going to be attached to monitors. So they're going to be tagged according to the start triage system. Now, in telehealth, what changes? This is what changes. On site, your paper triage tag is going to be changed to a PDA, which is basically a handheld first responder device. The handheld first responder device, you just scan, and it triages your patient. When you triage that patient, that information automatically goes into, it becomes data. How does that help me? Number one, it makes everything faster. Number two, I automatically have data. I don't have to have a paper and collect paper, and the paper gets lost. This is not going to happen. This also helps me with research, which you'll see how it later on affects preparedness. En route. En route, what happens? So you have the EOC, which is the image you see on the right, and you have the image on the left, which is the Hospital Incident Command Center or the Telehealth Center in hospitals. If you see at the EOC, you have two screens. One screen where you can have a video of the patient, and the other screen where you get the vitals. You can get full ICU set through that screen. So why is it relevant to toxicology? If you have a patient with a toxidrome, what you see on those screens is basically all you need to make your diagnosis, give your patient the antidote en route, and then re-triage them. If necessary, they might start red, you give them the antidote, they become green. What does this help with? You're decreasing, when you're re-triaging your patient, or you're treating your patient en route, you're decreasing ED flow. You're decreasing the flow to specialty centers. You're helping out the EMS, which are overrun and overwhelmed at that point in time. So this is basically what happens. Studies have shown that if you use telehealth, the number of deaths that occur during transfer from scene to a specialty center decreases. Total transfers decrease. Total number of ED beds used decrease. That increases your medical surge capacity. And ED waiting times also decrease. So it's a win-win situation. It's a lot of technology. It may be new to people, but actually putting this into our practice helps us out a lot in many, many ways. So if you think of telehealth and you think of the phases of the disaster response, it affects every single phase of the disaster response. So with preparedness and mitigation, we already talked about how what you are doing with telehealth is collecting data. Anything you get from your patient that is on your screen is automatically data. You use that, you can publish research. It's easy. You have an EHR system. You take the data from the telehealth, publish research. What does research do? It enhances our planning. It enhances our preparedness. We know what went wrong last time, and we can make sure it doesn't happen next time. What were we missing last time? We'll apply it next time. Response. We already talked about PDAs, assisting in field triage, electronic triage tags. Another point that we need to take account is virtual increase in medical surge capacity. So what is that? That's basically you're on field. You're lacking physicians, or you're lacking any healthcare providers to triage your patients. You can virtually have another physician on the site, and that physician is going to tell you, well, triage this guy red, triage this guy green, triage this guy yellow. That increases your surge capacity. Also with transport and treatment. Like, as we said, we can treat the patient en route, or we can retransport, or we can send home. Recovery. There are certain pandemics or MCIs that usually have a very prolonged recovery. Things like pandemic flus, earthquakes, tsunamis. You can assist with the recovery of the patient via telehealth. You can provide like doctors virtually to assist patients at home, to follow them up. You can follow the labs of your patients virtually, especially for psychotherapy services or family support after a disaster. That can also be all done virtually. Also, you have inter-hospital communications. So let's say you have an ED and you have a specialty center, and the specialty center wants to downgrade so they can provide more beds. Telehealth gives you that. It allows inter-hospital communication. Another thing that you can take into account is the EMS. Now, if the EMS is transporting one person to another place and you don't have a physician to assess that patient, you're going to overwhelm the EMS capacity. So basically, that inter-hospital communication really decreases all the weight on the EMS services. That is basically the telehealth. These are my sources. That's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much. We'll take questions actually at the end of the session.
At the end. Okay. Thank you.
So this morning, I've been asked to talk about occupational chemical exposures and the role the Poison Center plays in managing these cases. And I have a unique perspective because we do have relationships with other agencies that allow us to work on these cases. So just a little bit of housekeeping, so I don't have any disclosures, but today what I want to do is make sure you understand the ways that poison centers can impact, the impact we can have when dealing with occupational chemical exposure events, understanding the importance of developing partnerships with other agencies, and then I want you to think about the last time there might have been a chemical event. I want you to assess in your mind what role your poison center or what role you played as a toxicologist in that event. So just a reminder for those of you who weren't at my talk yesterday, I am in Atlanta, Georgia. We are a population less than half of what it is here in Istanbul. We have a population of 10.5 million people, and we are housed in one of the largest teaching hospitals in the southeast. Dr. Kazi, is it an 800-bed hospital? So yeah, something like that. 800-bed hospital in our institution, and the Poison Center is a department in that institution. We're one of 55 in the United States, as you probably know, and we are quite busy. You know, around 300 or so calls every day handled by our Poison Center. Now, in order to handle these calls, We have fairly advanced call handling capabilities, and you could compare them to what you have in your area, but communication technology and making the connection is important for us to report these cases. So for us, we have a very feature-rich telecom system. And what do I mean by a feature-rich telecom system? Well, we have various ways we can affect the queuing of the calls that come in. We have in our system what is called skill-based routing. If you're unfamiliar with skill-based routing, is say for example, we have someone who speaks the Turkish language calling in, and they only speak Turkish language, and many of us speak English. If there's one person in my department that could speak Turkish, we will give them a special designation, so even though they're still waiting for a call and they may be fourth in the queue to answer the call because they've waited a short amount of time, if you speak Turkish and you're looking for someone who speaks Turkey and they're available, the call will immediately go to them. And in our situation, we do get calls from Spanish-speaking people. Most of us speak English, but if I'm waiting for a call for English and I do speak Spanish, even though 3 of my colleagues are next to answer calls, the call will be routed to me first so the patient doesn't wait long. So it's called skill-based routing, and we're able to do fancy maneuvers with the way the calls are accepted. We also have the capability of working from home, and that's always a good benefit. In fact, some of our poison specialists work from home about 70% of their work. So 7 days out of 10, they may be working from home. They don't have to come into the hospital. They don't have to come into the office. We give them equipment. We give them a phone. We give them our resources, and they work from home as if they were in the office. One of the unique things about contacting us is that we were the first poison center in all of the United States to start accepting chat messages and email live. So these chat messages and these emails would go and mix with our phone calls, and so whether you're chatting, whether you're emailing, you could contact the poison center. Now, I don't know about some of you, I have older kids. They're in their late 20s. They don't use the phone anymore to call. They only use texting, and they only use messaging. So we have to adapt our practice so that we can attract some of these people who use alternative ways to contact us. One of the things that we're going to be adding in 2020 is accepting emergency calls by text messaging. So we have very elaborate equipment, so you can call us, you can chat with us, and you can email us, and the call or the encounter will be happening in real time. So that's what's important. Now, when you look at our technology in the Poison Center, not only do we have one phone system, we have a backup phone system. Whether that system goes down, we have to be able to provide 24-hour support to our service area. So we have 2 phone systems in the office, we have 2 phone systems in people's homes. So we're able, if in the event of an emergency, to be able to provide our services without interruption. We also have 2 different lines coming into the Poison Center. So if one of these lines get cut off, we still have backup lines to provide telephone services to the people and the public who use our phone system. So there's a lot of redundancy. And as you think about what you're doing in your centers, what you're doing in your poison service area, for us, we have a contract with public health, and we told public health, we will be available every minute of every hour of every day, regardless of the technological failures. Because all of us know things break. It's never always perfect to have communication lines open. So we have all these systems that allow us to have service. So when we have a chemical event, people will be able to call, even if one of our phone systems is not working. Now, I don't know about your capabilities, but because we're so busy, we can handle almost 70 calls simultaneously into our office. Now, the problem is I don't have 70 people working at the same time, but 70 people can simultaneously call into our area, into our phone system without getting a busy signal. Now, what happens in the event of a chemical event, a mass exposure? Will your phone system be able to handle the extra calls coming in, or will they always get busy signals? We invested our money in technology that allows us to increase the number of calls that come in to our center without a busy signal. We can handle almost, and you'll see shortly, we could handle almost 10 times the amount of calls without someone getting a busy signal. Because there's nothing more frustrating if you're calling emergency and it's busy. So we have the capability to turn on the programs that allow us to increase capacity. And I'll talk about the technology here. So it's called the SUFER phone system. I mentioned it the other day. I didn't really elaborate. But SUFER stands for Surge Public Health Emergency Response. This allows our system to increase and expand our capabilities, but it's a technology that we've had for almost 10 years now. And not only does it provide access to more people, it also has a unique feature of being able to put messaging as if you were choosing messages from a phone tree. Press 1 if you want to hear about the common signs and symptoms. Press 2 for treatment. Press 3 for should you leave your area because of chemical gas. So instead of talking to a human, you can listen to live messages that are built for that specific event. Instead of talking to a human, I may only have 12 or 13 people in the call center. But if there's a mass event, we have in place a way that we could give people messages. Now, if they want to call us, listen to the messages, and still want to talk to a human being, there's a way for the system to route that call to a live person. So, when you look at this hotline, if there's an emergency in the state that requires, messaging, we can handle up to 580, almost 600 calls at the same time without our phone system breaking. Because you've heard of crashing the internet, right? You've heard of crashing a website. Well, why does that happen? Too many people are accessing the website, and now you can't do it anymore. The same thing works in phone systems. So in the event of an emergency where you have many more calls, your capabilities have to be increased or they will break your phone system. So we have the ability to handle almost 600 calls, and the reason why the state wanted us to have this technology is they wanted us to be prepared in the event of chemical exposures, chemical emergencies, mass exposures, for the public to be able to access us. Now, the beauty about the messaging in chemical events is it's all text to speech. So if a message is developed, we type it, we type the message, and then the translator for the computer converts it to words. And so we can put many messages, as you could see here, you could put many messages into the system and many options for someone to listen to various messages. You can, when we are asked to do special messaging, it probably takes us 30 minutes to 1 hour to fully configure the system. The one thing that we ask our partners in the health department to do is write the messages for us. we'll load it into our system, we'll type it in, we'll load the program, and then automatically the messages start talking in computer voice. So it's a great system to have in the event you're looking at developing messages in the event of a mass emergency. Now, when someone's calling in, if there's a fire in Istanbul, and you want to just let the people in Istanbul know, as opposed to if you're in Cappadocia, if the fire's only here, then you will hear specific information about the fire here that has toxic fumes. So what you need to do is call the special number, put in the designated area number that you want to hear messages for, and then you choose the message that you want, and then choose the options if you want to listen to all the messages or you want to talk to a live human being. So that's what's that's the beauty of this system, is you could listen to the computer messages as well as listen to the live voice. Now, the whole purpose of this talk is to talk about chemical occupational exposures, and we have a unique perspective in that we actually published a paper not too long ago, I think in 2017, about the relationship that we have with a governmental agency to enhance and to recognize those exposures that happen while someone is in the workplace. So these are occupational chemical exposures, and we are working with a government agency called OSHA. I don't know if they have a similar organization here in Turkey, but who is OSHA? If you're unfamiliar, back in the 1970s, the US government and the Congress passed legislation that called for a law that requires safety in the workplace. And the name of that organization they called the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. And what this was to promote and enforce standards for safety in the workplace. And so we have this government agency that really tries to enforce safety regulation, because when you look at the incidence of injury, there are millions of people who suffer, in the workplace. In fact, reported on a yearly basis, over 4 million workers suffer some kind of serious job-related injury or illness. And that's a lot of exposures. And so in 2014, we started doing exposures in the workplace, and we started not only tracking them, we were getting the calls already, but we were starting to report the calls to the government agency. They never asked for those calls before, but we had the database. So we would collect information about the patients, the poison specialists and the doctors would give advice on how to treat these patients. Now, the one thing that was different is when you call into our poison center, every call is kept confidential and private. We don't release the information to anybody, even the government. So we ask the patient, if you were having a problem in the workplace, will you give us the permission to notify the government that you had an injury at work? Some people, they were worried about retaliation, and so they don't want to give any information. Other folks said, yes, I want the government to investigate. So I'll give you my name, I'll give you my number, I'll give you the company that I work for. So we have to ask everybody for the permission to release their name.
But what about if they tell you, yes, let them know, but don't tell my name?
Yes, that's the first thing we do, is we release the information to the government, but what we do is we blind all the cases. So the government doesn't even know the patient. We are just trying to get permission to release the fact that an incident occurred. We don't ever release the name, but we do identify the company, so that there's the possibility of investigation. Now, with OSHA, every week we collect data from the workplace, and every week we submit them all the cases. In 2018, we had over 800 cases from the workplace that were reported to us. Of that 810 cases, only about 25% allowed us to release information. So not everybody, because they may be worried about job security. Now, one of the things that you have to do when you're having a program like this is you have to educate your staff. As I was talking earlier, Doctor, about the poison specialist, all our cases are documented. Now, the beauty of our specific EMR is that if someone has a workplace exposure, once they code and they use the code that the exposure happened in their place of business, automatically a reminder comes up. So if you tell the computer this happened at work, a reminder comes up that says, hey, what kind of occupation is this person? You know, will they allow us to pass their information to the government, so that our intakers of the calls will be reminded, so they don't forget that this is a unique case. So we have unique tools that allow us to remind us that we must ask more questions, okay? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of cases where they called into the poison center and then we released the information to the government. For example, in this case, you have a 23-year-old who went to the emergency room after they were exposed at work to chemicals in their eye and their skin. They suffered burns to the cornea. The patient allowed us to give this case to the government, and when OSHA came in to investigate, they found some interesting things about this company. This company is an oil change company, and they failed to provide eye wash stations and other decontamination stations at work. They did not have the proper documentation at home, and after the government investigated, they fined and gave serious citations to the business of around $21,000. So the government said, you're not making your workplace safe. You have to fix the issues here before you can open your work again. In this case, case number 2, there was a 50-year-old who was exposed to chemicals for swimming pools. These chemicals fell onto his head, face, and chest. He was washed at the scene. He went into the emergency room with respiratory distress and altered mental status. OSHA came in and investigated, and here's what they found. When they investigated the company did not even report to the government that one of their workers was injured. There's a requirement for the government in these kind of businesses to report when a patient goes to the hospital. So failure number 1, they did not report the incident. Number 2, they did not provide a place that had that was free from hazards. They did not have body washing or eye exposure capabilities. They did not have the proper documentation in place for the chemicals, and they too were also cited and given tickets, and they were fined almost $30,000 for their issues. So there are many work-related exposures that get called into our poison center. We were able to collaborate with our government organizations to make the workplace safer by being able to report these cases to the government. And it's important for us that we had this relationship to forge with OSHA. So in summary, if you're looking at starting with a good communication lane for your patients to call, make sure you have a robust communication strategy. Do your job well, but once you've done your job well, look for other ways you can impact your community. And for us, it was a matter of recognizing that there were exposures happening in the workplace, that safety was being neglected. So we formed a partnership with the organization that looks for safety in the workplace, and we wanted to make, at least in Georgia, the patients that much more safer. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one question. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation about the technology, using technology in your system PCC consultation. I would like to ask, in the future, using the virtual intelligence applications, if these applications replaced by the PCC specialist.
Is
it any risk?
So the question is there, because of technology and the explosion of technology, will there ever be a point where we'll replace human beings and only have a technology?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any risk for that.
No.
Because you could write a document, you could have an algorithm, but you need someone to interpret it. You need someone to understand it. And so I don't see technology being the only answer. You have to rely on experience.
Yeah.
You have to have bedside consultations. So technology
I agree with you. Thank
will,
you.
will never.
Thank you, Gaylor. I'm totally agree
And
with
Andy,
you.
I could talk to you, Andy, afterwards. I could talk to you, Andy, afterwards.
Okay, so next speaker is Dr. Suad Alabri from Oman, and she's talking about cardiovascular complication of performance-enhancing drugs. Please.
I had a question for Dr. Sultan. First, I wanted to ask what happened to the camel, but you already answered that question. Secondly, is you talked about how grammar has changed from one research to the other. What is your opinion on using websites like Grammarly, which automatically changes the grammar for you in whatever whatever you have?
Yeah, I use Grammarly sometimes. There are many softwares you can use, but sometimes you have, even after you use the software, you have to read it to make sure that it makes sense or not. You can ask sometimes a colleague, because even if you hire native English speakers, sometimes when they change things, the meaning would be changed. So you have to follow up after them. Was this the answer for you? Yeah, regarding the camel, usually they slaughter the camel quickly so they can get benefit of the meat. Yeah, but mostly he was killed instantaneously.
For the most question, I kind of request you to ask your question and break, because the time is over. We have to run to catch the time. Thank you very much. We are going to finish the section. Dr. Kasi, one time we have to be here again.
Yeah, so the next session starts in just 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I would like to present the next speakers, Dr. Sultan Al-Waji. He is an epidemiologist and independent researcher working in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Graduated from Al-Qurra University in Mecca with Bachelor of Medicine, Master of Public Health from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Dr. Sultan, you are welcome. You have 25 minutes, please.
Although case report is underestimated sometimes, for one reason, because many people read it, but few people cite case report, because usually case report about rare things or atypical presentation. It's not about something common. That's why it's not very widely cited. That's why the editor of the journals sometimes do not like case report. But if you want to write a case report, you have to make sure that you are submitting the case report to a journal that is interested in case report, or they are publishing case report, because you don't want to go through a lengthy process, then you figure out the answer from the editor that actually we do not publish a case report, which it happens sometimes. So at the beginning, what's case report? Can you report anything, or it has to have specific like feature or criteria? What do you think? Can you hear me now? Or do I have to go back? So case report, it's not necessary to be very rare. Sometimes when you want to report a case and you ask a friend or a colleague, and they would ask you that, you want to put the time? They will ask you, okay, that's fine. They will ask you, this case has already been written. So why you are writing this case? So somebody published it already. Why you are writing this case? It's not necessary to be atypical or very rare. Sometimes for educational purpose, let's say sometimes to increase awareness about specific disease that's not common in specific area. Because the main idea is to communicate with your colleague, to communicate with the other healthcare providers that we start to see these things. For example, in Saudi Arabia, let's say that I remember a friend of mine said that female, she was a back passenger and she asked the driver to drive. He refused, but she insisted, and she was coming out of a party and she was drunk. This is new. So she drove, and she was involved in road traffic injuries. The driver was in the ICU. So it was critical. We are not used to see these things, but start to happen. So you want to increase the awareness of law enforcement people and the clinician that driving under influence start to happen in this geographical area. I said the journal editor usually do not like it because it's not cited, but sometimes because it's at the bottom of the evidence-based pyramid. We usually start from expert opinion, then we go up, and the case report usually it's down. It's not like randomized controlled clinical trial. But for rare things, you cannot actually do randomized controlled clinical trials. So sometimes the case report is the start of, let's say, a systematic review meta-analysis. Most of the bigger research started with observational study or even case report. Like Dr. Lisa, when she mentioned about the HIV in the 1981, it was a case reported in the CDC, the weekly morbidity and mortality report. Then another case came from San Francisco. A third case came from New York. Then it became as a case series. Then somebody started to do official research to figure out what's going on. Sometimes atypical presentation of common disease, challenging sometimes case, sometimes. So the main thing is a learning opportunity or like highlighting a message of this case. What's usually it's not reported a lot. Failure story. We need people to write about their failure. Let's say that you use something new, but you missed it miserably. We need to report about this because that's fine. Because if you do something and you fail at it, and you report it or you communicated with other physician, you are increasing the awareness that this technique does not work. So I mentioned all these, not necessary to be the first case. This was the Kaposi sarcoma in the 1981, published in the Mortality and Morbidity Weekly Report. Case series is 3 or more. Some of the people said it's 4 or more of the cases. You can call it case series. But if it's 1, 2, up to 3, you can report it as a case report. So what's the structure of the case report? Generally speaking, in research, we have specific form. We call it IMRAD, which is introduction, method, result, and discussion. And you put conclusion. So this is the main structure we usually put it for any research. But for the case report, it's a little bit different. And the good thing that case report mimic your clinical documentation. So you put an introduction, why you are writing this case, brief sentences about the disease you are describing, then case presentation, clinical history of the patient and the significant things, the management or the outcome. Then discussion, what do you think about this? Compare it with previous case, and then you conclude. So it's very easy, you can write it in one day. But you have to know how to write the citation, the references, and usually it's preferred to use a software. So you make sure that you put the citation in the proper style, because each journal asks for specific style. Sometimes you submit it and they said this is Vancouver, we need Harvard, or we need the AMA style. So usually when you want to publish something, you have to know which journal you are submitting your paper to. Take the author instruction, look at the instruction, and try to commit all the things, all the changes based on what they are looking for. So this is the structure of the case report. Title, abstract. Usually abstract is less than 100 or 200 words. And for the case report, they usually ask less than 1,500, 1,500, sometimes less than this. And this is all through the journal. You go to the journal and check what they are looking for. Introduction or background, then the case presentation, discussion, and conclusion. I will go through every one and talk briefly about the structure of case report. There is like a guidelines for any research design. For randomized controlled clinical trials, they have specific guideline. There is a guideline for case report, although not all the journal ask you to go with this guideline. The best thing, you go to the website of the journal and you see what are the requirements, what are the author instruction. If you don't find it, then you can go with the guideline. Title should be brief, informative, descriptive of a case report. Some journal ask you to write case report, like saying this is a case report of rare or atypical presentation. Other journals say no, do not mention this. So you have to make sure what they are asking for. Are they asking for this or not? Because you don't want to spend weeks, then they ask you to remove the word case report. Target mesh terms, if you go to PubMed, there is a specific characters called medical subject heading. They classify, they meet twice yearly, and they classify each disease on specific name, just to make sure when you put key terms for a specific disease, you find all the variation. For example, if I publish a paper about road traffic injuries, and you type motor vehicle collisions, you're going to get my research, because they understand these terms mean different things and they collected in a specific place. If you go to PubMed, there is something called MISH database. You go and type the keywords there and you try to figure out what are the MISH terms you are looking for. Some of them ask to write a rare case or atypical case. If you want to try writing first case, make sure it's first case. Because sometimes you say first, but if I do literature review, I'm going to find more cases of this. So as I mentioned, some say avoid, some say no. You can write a rare case or case report. Keywords, this is important. Usually choose 2 to 5. If you succeed at choosing the proper keywords, this would help other researchers when they go and do the Google Scholar search or PubMed through Medline to find your topic. And if the journal is indexed in PubMed, it's more likely that people will find your paper. Abstract brief, we said less than 200 words. Total case report, less than 2,000 or 1,500. Structure or unstructured. Sometimes they ask you for abstract, like in paragraph, mention everything, but in chronological order, introduction and methods, result. Sometimes they said no, write objectives or aim, then you put like 1 or 2 sentences, then write methods, then write. So this is the structure and this is the unstructured. Check the journal instruction. Usually check the journal instruction. Actually, it takes a lot of time to change from journal to journal. So if you get rejected or you want to change the journal, you have to change things in the paper, and usually it takes times because you change the style, you change the reference sometimes, how you put the reference, you change the grammar or punctuation from American to British or Australian. Key elements in abstract, try to mention these key important things. Sometimes you write a paper and after 3 months or 6 months, when you want to publish it, they ask you for abstract. Then you write the abstract without going back to the paper. Then you figure out there is discrepancy. The things in the abstract a little bit different than the original paper. And usually do not believe any abstract Especially if you are trying to make a decision on this, you have to go and read the methods of the paper, because sometimes they mention something a little bit different than what the paper mentioned. And sometimes even things are the opposite. It shouldn't be like this, but you have to make sure you read the whole paper if you want to depend on that paper. Because sometimes you do not have access to the literature, so you just depend on the abstract. But this is not usually a good tactic. The introduction mentioned briefly things about the topic. Landmark papers, you can mention them in the introduction. Also, case presentation. This is mimicking what you have seen in the hospital. You just mentioned that we have this patient present with this disease and we did this. 2 or 3 paragraphs. Do not be obliged that you have to write everything about the patient, because you have only 2,000 words. You cannot write everything. You have to make it very short. Because in communication, you want to be clear and concise. Finish the story, even if you wait for follow-up. If you write the case and you don't know what happened to the patient, wait for a couple of days or weeks to say that patient didn't survive or went back home or deceased or something. Because it's like story. You are communicating with the clinician or other provider and you want to end it. You don't want to cut it in the middle, especially when the outcome is very important. Discussion, do brief literature review and emphasize on the learning point why you are reporting such case. Usually mention this. We are reporting the first case of this in this geographical area. Or we are reporting this because we started seeing these cases in our geographical area. Focus literature. When you come to the discussion, do not just report a case as if it's in solo. No, try to make a correlation between previous cases that have been reported in the literature and try to compare what's different from these previous, because discussion is like group discussion. We talk to each other. It has to be like kind of interactive. You mentioned X says, Y says, we notice this. So do not make it like just a paragraph and you are mentioning, you are repeating the result. It has to be different than the result. It's interpretation of the result based on the other papers. Compare and contrast. Finish with what your case add to the literature. In conclusion, should include evidence-based recommendation. Usually when you recommend something, especially with the case report, you have to base it on evidence, because usually this is a rare things. We do not have a lot of published recommendation about this disease. So try as much as you can support your decision in recommending specific things. Emphasize on the applicability of the practice. This is the main idea. If you want to change practice, if you want to increase awareness, you have to convince people that we did this with this case and the result was, for example, satisfactory or not satisfactory. Example of not very rare or first case. So I mentioned it doesn't have to be the first case. This is one of the case report I'm submitting now. It's a road traffic injuries in the middle of the city, in the highway, between 2 cities, but it was still in the same city. The car didn't leave. And the road wasn't lit very well. There was no light, and a camel came. It was an SUV, hit the camel. The car swerved twice, flipped over twice. The driver was putting seat belt, the baby in the back with the seat belt. The woman, the front passenger, wasn't seat belted. She was ejected and died on scene. So it's, if we report this, somebody would say, yeah, but this is a camel with the car, so what's the point? There is a point here. There is a point that although this is, it shouldn't happening, especially in a city, but it happened, we don't know what's the behavior of the accident. We usually, when we talk about accident, we talk about people who are texting and driving or people who are overspeeding, but we are not talking about uncommon things like animals. And we figure out that camels, accident with camels in the Middle East mainly, sometimes in Australia. In Australia, they have the kangaroo and other animals, but it happens, and it can increase the mortality of road traffic injuries. Then we spoke about the intervention that should have been implemented on the street, probably, or on the animals. Sometimes they put stripe with the light on these animals. Other thing, we saw a couple of cases with elderly people when Dr. Lisa talked about diabetes. I remember I was working with the Ministry of Health in health policy, And some of them, they did a research survey, and they mentioned that diabetes in Saudi Arabia, they said 8%, some of them said 10%. The problem, we are a young population. Diabetes usually happens in middle age and elderly. But when they did the subgroup analysis of that survey, people in Saudi Arabia who are 65 and above, 50% of them diabetic. Can you imagine this? So if you are 50 years old or 40, you're going to be diabetic. It's 50%. And this is previous research. We don't know if we continue on this, maybe it's going to be 60%. So one of the cases I saw in the hospital, I was taking history from the patient, and he was having a chest pain. He was 50 something. Then during the encounter with the patient, he said, this is after that pills, and he started cursing the pills. I was like, which pills? Then I figured out that he was using Viagra. At the same time, he was having angina and taking medication. So due to the interaction, he had a myocardial infarction. And the problem, they take it from the pharmacy over the counter. They do not have prescription. And the pharmacists even do not give instruction that if you are taking medication for the heart, you have to make sure you are not taking them at the same times. So although maybe this is not a very rare, but at least you are increasing awareness and mentioning some recommendation that need to be implemented not on the physician only, but on the pharmacist or on the patient. Graphic and image, this is good. If you mention something, if you put illustration, it makes your paper looks nicer. It's kind of like entertaining. If you entertain the readers, people would read your articles. They probably would cite it. The journal would like it. But usually follow the instruction. Sometimes they don't want more than 3 table or 3 image. Be creative. Feel free to be creative. You can create something. You can draw something or hire a video animator. Like now I'm trying to hire a video animator. I contacted one of them because I figure out when there is an accident, sedan car with a camel, usually because the camel is 2-meter height and the sedan is a little bit lower. The weight of the camel is more than 500 kilograms. So if they hit the camel, usually the camel fell on the passenger and they get killed. But it's SUV or family car, usually the camel will be ejected. So this might indicate the fatality of the accident. And I think the speed has another factor. If you are driving at high speed, more likely the camel will fall in the car. But if you hit a camel on a low speed, it will fall in the front side of the car. So you can add some information, especially the mechanism of the accident. Practical tips to write and publish a case report. Consent the patient. This is the first thing you do. If you see interesting things in the hospital, consent the patient before he goes. Because if you tell me after 2 weeks, I want you to help me in writing case report, if the patient left and we do not have a consent, that's an issue. Put a deadline. If you agree with your consultant to write a case report, let's write this in 2 weeks. Or I will give you my final case report and then you review it in 1 week. Agree on authorship. Sometimes conflict happens, especially between 2 different departments. We are the emergency medicine. We saw interesting case, admitted the patient, then the radiologist, they published the paper, but we published at the same times. So try to, if it's different perspective, they are publishing from radiological perspective, that's fine. But if it's the same case, it doesn't look nice when you have a conflict of authorship on a case report. Plan to succeed at the 3rd trial. I'm a researcher, so I usually see clinicians, they are frustrated because they tried once, twice, or 3 times to publish something, but they weren't successful at this. Let me ask you a question. Do you think your first intubation will be successful? I don't think so. Do you think your first physical examination will be presented, or people would say that this is the best physical examination? So in research, it's the same thing. You do the research, you failed first time, you get rejected second time, third time rejected, then you resubmit again. You might succeed after 4th time, but that's fine. It's a learning opportunity. The more you try, especially with the supervisor, the more you learn. Authorship, make sure you do not have a conflict. Single author usually responsible for the load of the work. Sometimes a single author may be the senior, but the senior need to have the load of the work. Being a clinician, or if the patient is admitted under your name, doesn't give you the authorship. You can publish a case report while the treating surgeon or clinician was not involved in the case in the writing or intellectual.
Yes,
process.
1 minute.
Okay. Avoid double publication, ethics and ethical approval. You need to have the informed consent from the patient, okay? If you want to show the picture of the patient, there is another form. In some institution, they ask you for IRB, institutional review board. It's not the usual practice, but some hospital ask for this. And avoid plagiarism. You can check the journal. Sometimes they mention topics that they accept. For example, they said we take case report in trauma or injury, stuff like that. Drawback of case report, we said it's at the bottom of the evidence-based medicine. Due to the high volume, journal usually accept very few number, limited number. And some journals do not accept case report. Avoid making firm judgment because it's one observation. Do not say that this treatment is for this disease. Before claiming rarity, make sure it's rare. Few grammar mistakes is acceptable. Typos are not acceptable. Even if you are non-native speaker, typos usually means that you were in a hurry or you do not have time to review your paper. Example of non-case report, we said the AIDS, the thalidomide, it started with the case report, with the congenital anomaly, the fenfluramine, which is the appetite suppressant with the pulmonary hypertension, and the Zika virus. This is the guideline for the case report. Some journal ask for this. Yeah, so this is just a video. I was showing how when I write, usually try to use a dictionary, especially if English is not your first language, to be very handy for you. Because you need the thesaurus, you need to check for words, you need to check for spelling. If it takes you a long time, you will get bored and you wouldn't go and check the dictionary every now and then. But usually writing is not like speaking. It doesn't come from the first time. Even native speakers, sometimes they write things, and when they read it again, they do not maybe understand it, or it's not very clear. And this is the last video. You can hire somebody to check your writing, check your English, and you can pay them per page as a native speaker. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. We'll take questions at the end of the session. Okay. Our next speaker, Dr. Razan Rahimi. She completed a residency from the Kuwait Board of Emergency Medicine. She's currently a staff physician in the emergency department at a hospital in Kuwait City. She's going to talk about one of her interests, which is telemedicine.
No experience of any mad honey, so I can't. If any one of you has ever seen any cases of mad honey? Okay, good, good.
Thank you
Over
very
to you,
much
sir.
to Menetox and EPAT for inviting me. I'm proud to collaborate this assembly. My presentation topic is mud honey. Mud honey poisoning, not also this presentation, my presentation topic, also my scientific life main topics. I will explain some my expert. I like there to no conflict of interest. First, let's see some chronologic old writing and ancient writing about mud honey. In ancient and old writings, we first seen Xenophon. Xenophon has a book called Anabasis. In this book, he mentioned about the mud honey. He told that his soldiers who ate mud honey looked like drunk people. This is first used mud honey word in the past. First we seen mud honey word in this book. Second, we seen Strabo. He is also an historian in ancient time. Strobo also told this book, his book, Pompey's army was destroyed by feeding methane. This war Strobo's mentioned about is near the Trabzon, like Xenophon mentioned about this war, his war. Centuries after these ancient history writers, Mr. Coleman said that he gave medical attention about, explain some case, 14 case, which 3 of them died. This is important for us because this mortality is first described these books, these relators. The distribution rhododendrons and methane-posing cases in Turkey. Grantosine comes from the rhododendron flowers, and this makes the honey posing in Turkey. Plants belong genus rhododendron have wide distribution area in Black Sea region, which extends from the Marmara region to Caucasia. We've seen. This area is rhododendron ponticum area. This area is rhododendron luteum area. There are remarkable harmony between the distribution areas plants genus rhododendron and the areas where posing cases. Worldwide, when methane poisoning cases are analyzed according to countries, it is seen that the most cases of methane poisoning occur in Turkey. Nepal is second country. South Korea comes third. As we see, Turkey is first one, Nepal and South Korea is second and third case we see. Methane poisoning produced in this country can export Europe, Asia, and others countries. Because of this, some poison case can be appears in this area. Out of the Turkey, Nepal, and South Korea, we can see methane poisoning cases. For what we use, people use methane. Methane generally consumed but accidentally in Black Sea region. People don't know how it contains grant-toxin or not. Methane can also consumed as alternative therapy for health problems such as digestive system, hypertension, sexual dysfunction, wound healing. Methane also used to diabetic patient for blood sugar regulation. When they use it as an alternative therapy, it can be poison this person. The poison effect of methane originates from toxic compound called grant-toxin. Based on the literature, so far we 60 grant-toxin types, and their glycosid have been isolated from the various ecosia plants. Primary toxic compounds are grant-toxin 1 and 3. Primary toxic 1 and 3. Physical symptoms from methane poisoning appear after dose-dependent latent period of several minutes, approximately 3 hours. Patients exposed to low-dose grant-toxin typically recover within few hours. In more severe cases, symptoms may persist 24 hours or longer may be required medical treatment. Grantoxin are capable of binding the group to receptor regional voltage gated sodium channels. Grantoxin only binds the activated conformation of sodium channels. After binding of the receptor, grantoxin prevents inactivation of sodium channel. This activated conformation allows the influx of sodium, and this is stop the membrane activation and neural activity. The main symptoms believed to caused by continued sodium channel activation, cell deposition, and enhanced stimulation of the vagal nerve system. Depending on this, various cardiac conduction disorders may develop, such as varying degree of heart block, nodal rhythm, complete atrioventricular block, and second degree heart block we can see. The main common symptom in methanoposing cardiac symptom methanoposing patient is sinusal bradycardia. Also, clinical characteristic. What is the main clinical characteristic of methanoposing patients? We can see in emergency department this patient. Main symptom this is hypertension, bradycardia, nausea or vomiting, sweating, dizziness, impaired consciousness, fainting, blurred vision, or diplopia. We can see. Diagnosis based on patient history and clinical finding. SMSMS system need diagnostic tools not used in Turkey now. Maybe in the future we can use this diagnostic tool. There are similarities in clinical status between methanopoisoning and cholinergic poisoning. It is important to efficiently differentiate between the two types of poisoning, emergency department, to initiate appropriate and effective therapy. Biochemical data which was obtained in this study do not support the hypothesis that methanopoisoning should regard as cholinergic poisoning. It's different. Only the same is atropine treatment is useful, methanopoisoning and cholinergic poisoning. Clinical characteristic. We seen one patient methanopoisoning related asystole. This is first case and only one case to after the poisoning we seen asystole. After we after this after we published this case report, we seen a famous film, Sherlock Holmes, named Sherlock Holmes, mentioned about our case report. One of my colleagues said me that people made films your study. Did you see the Sherlock Holmes film? I said no. They said me that you should you have to watch Sherlock Holmes film. Let's watch this part of film. In this film, they said that as we wrote on my our case report, they said that in this film, Mathani poisoning, very well-known poison, which can temporarily block heart rate. They said also this film, this fragment. But we can't hear it. No. Okay. Ne diyorsun sen?
Sonraki saatte. Devam ediyorsun.
What's the treatment in this poisoning? We only two tools, atropine and IV fluids we use. Standard ACLS protocol if bradycardias appear. Supportive treatment, atropine and IV fluid we use for treatment. There is no specific antidote for gram toxin. Although symptoms and signs can be alarming and sometimes life-threatening, useful supportive care with electrocardiographic monitoring. Normal saline infusion, as I said, we used if complete heart broke and appear, we can use cardiac pacemaker. A lot of research has been done on Mathani poisoning in Canlı Technical University Medical Faculty Department of Emergency Service, Emergency Medicine. The high incidence of, let's look at some of it. One of them, dose-dependent effect of gram toxin in cardiovascular system. Second one is analgesic effect of Mathani poisoning, and is gram toxin directly responsible Mathani poisoning associated seizure? Does Mathani poisoning require hospital admission? Clinical review of Mathani poisoning with flow Mathani, and also maybe 5 or 6 more example. The honey, the poison, and the weapon the topics presentation was we have. Are there any new project about Mathani in this our department? Yes, we have new projects. We are doing some new studies. The most important one is project developed a diagnostic kit for Mathani poisoning. I think the last one, this project, the last project is the best one for Mathani poisoning disease. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
From front flower is Rhododendron ponticum, the back is Rhododendron luteum. This view is Black Sea Mountains. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Because actually, because we are facing with this patient. Actually, we have a patient with same symptoms after injection of.
Can you just keep the mic near your mouth?
My question is how we can differentiate. This is hypotensive bradycardia. This from the honey itself, or it is contaminated honey, because we know that a lot of honey is contaminated with other substance, which can cause bradycardia and hypotensive. How we can differentiate between this?
I think you mean old honey don't poison. You mean?
No.
How can we differentiate what?
I mean, many manufacturers, they are producing honey. They are contaminated with other substances, which can cause bradycardia and hypotensive. How we can
like what other symptoms you mean?
Because what I want to say, because what I remember that when I'm talking about that, what the case was, I'm showing that the honey was definitely contaminated with something. I'm not sure what was that one, but if it was contaminated.
His question is, can there be any other contaminant which can cause the similar kind of?
As we case, we don't have any contamination.
You don't
honey,
think that
honey.
there is
Yes.
any
Yeah.
such?
Or contamination is only gram toxin.
Okay. Okay. I think it's better that you can maybe discuss your problem with him at later. So thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. Let's give him. So I thought we were kindly done with the presentations, but we have Dr. Hussain, who's from Iraq, and he's going to present on thallium poisoning, his experience.
Yes, our next speaker, Dr. Hannah Bergbauer. She's a nurse midwife and nurse practitioner. Nurse midwife and nurse practitioner who focuses on international health programming. She's a consultant with Integral Global and currently stationed in Bangladesh, focusing on expanding access to care and quality improvement within the Rohingya and host communities, incorporating telehealth platforms into low-resource settings.
I can probably do it without, I think. Oh, so I have to use, okay. Everyone for being here. That was a great talk, giving sort of the history of telehealth, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about telehealth, but in a different capacity. The telehealth work that I've been involved in has been in low resource and vulnerable settings, so slightly different from the EMS perspective. So just sort of a broad definition of what is telemedicine. It's technology-enabled health and care management and delivery systems that extend capacity and access. So what does that mean? It just means that basically we're utilizing technology to expand the reach of providers and care access to patients in settings that they wouldn't normally have it. So we saw in the previous presentation, that the telemedicine was used in the field. I'm talking about actually taking it to rural settings or places that maybe are conflict zones or other things like that, where a person in the US or maybe couldn't even go, or providers can't get to. So why telehealth? These options provide sustainable medical expertise to those with the most vulnerability. So the quality of care increases, they have greater access and lower or no cost, because oftentimes when it comes to telehealth, the person on the other end of the camera is doing it for free, or it's a part of a package. So it's low to no cost, which is nice. So 50% of the world's population lacks adequate health care. And that's, we see typically in the global south, but also telehealth is being mobilized throughout the United States in rural areas as well, and in other countries that are considered high income due to lack of access. So I always like these world mappers. I don't know if anyone else uses them, but I think they do a good job of showing distribution, specifically in regards to the health workforce. So this is sort of an example of the distribution of physicians globally. So you can see, right, that higher income countries tend to have more physicians, which means that patients are generally going to have better access. It doesn't always guarantee that, right, because we know that oftentimes in countries like Bangladesh is a high-income country, but for example, in Bangladesh, 70% of the physicians are actually working in urban areas, while 60% of the population in the country lives in the rural areas, right? So it's disproportionate. But this is what, we see the continent of Africa becomes very, very small. Southeast Asia, like India, looks large in Bangladesh, but the distribution isn't even. And then we look at nurses, which also, are now being moved into telehealth platforms to do consulting as well. And you can see that the distribution isn't quite equal. And the same for midwives. So sort of background on how telehealth, that what I've been involved in is working is devices are provided. So the organization that I've worked closely with has been, it's called In Touch, that's the platform. And there's some pictures of the devices throughout the PowerPoint. And then the World Telehealth Initiative. So World Telehealth Initiative is a partner of In Touch. And basically, In Touch created this technology, and the World Telehealth Initiative has then linked them up with providers who will see the patients, from the other side of the world, which is pretty cool. Then extensive training on the use is conducted, and then the expertise based on what the service utilization is going to be will then be provided. So I'll talk about more like the utilization of the telehealth in a few slides because there's a lot of different ways. It's not just providing clinical care or consultations. It's now being used in low resource settings in a variety of other ways as well. And then these devices that I've been working with specifically they're trying to use internet as much as possible because it's more cost effective, but they're also using satellites as was mentioned in the previous presentation. Sure. Hello. Okay. So these are a few ways that we are currently utilizing or uptaking the telehealth models. So direct clinical, well, I say direct clinical care, it's a little bit more indirect, right? But for clinical care, scheduled expertise consultations, emergent high acuity cases. So for example, we might have somebody on call that you can ring into or that you can call into with a video capacity as well. Education and training is something that we're utilizing these models for pretty extensively, especially in settings that are unstable where someone who's a trainer can't actually go into. Technical assistance, so I'll tell some stories about some technical trainings that have been done. And then disaster preparedness and management, real-time response, and then a lot of mentoring. So this is actually a picture of students who were utilizing telehealth resources out in a village. You can't, they kind of cut it off, I'm sorry, but there actually was a telehealth device. This is in Tanzania, and they're out doing trainings with a local community, sort of training of trainer models. So it's actually, that device was using satellites. And this is what's called a mother's club. So it's a place where mothers can come and gather in these rural communities in Bangladesh. And they've got telehealth devices that actually allow someone to provide them a consultation for different things that they might be experiencing. So they might have a day where there's a dermatologist that can provide a consultation with one of the devices. This is an example of, you can see one of the devices down at the bottom here. And so not only was the training recorded, but this was really important for these midwives because they actually practice on an island. So it's an island that takes about 45 minutes by boat to get to the mainland from, and there's no emergency transport service. So there's not like an emergency boat or anything like that. Basically, if there's an emergency, that person has to get on what's called a sampan and make their way. So these midwives, there's 6 of them that basically run this labor and delivery ward, and they need to be able to do everything. And that's a challenge for them. So what we were able to do is do extensive trainings and mentorship, and also they have a telehealth device where they can call in to somebody who's on the mainland at any time for backup, which is different than they ever had access to before. And actually there's been a documented decrease, in some more severe morbidities, and then mortality hasn't changed, but that's a result of other factors. And so this is, you can see a nice graph representing fistula clinic and the mentoring sessions, and looking at, they were doing the same amount of surgeries throughout the entire period, but they were able to do more independently after trainings, and less mentoring sessions were then required. And then this was reported on yesterday using the telephone consultation service at the tertiary care hospitals in Lebanon for the toxicology exposures and the impacts of the reach of, having access to those services to help patients get specialized expert care. And then one of the projects that I've been working on has also been in the Rohingya refugee camp. And so when the Rohingya, I don't know if everyone is aware of that crisis, but basically in 2017 in August, there are about 1 million people who made their way from Myanmar to Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, as a result of genocide in Myanmar. And so, of course, at that point, there was no infrastructure, there was no healthcare services available to them, and the influx of providers from Dhaka and other cities throughout the country, they weren't specialized providers. So they may have been physicians or other trained healthcare personnel, but they weren't specialized. And so telehealth devices were able to be moved in pretty quickly, and satellites were used so that there could be access to things like a dermatologist, which oftentimes people say, why do they need a dermatologist? Acne is not an emergency. Well, when you have a skin condition that is life-threatening, it is an emergency. And so having the access to the dermatology, for example, was actually pretty important. And then in relation to more of a toxicology or sort of perspective, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of YABA, but YABA is a drug that there's been a big issue with the import of it through the camps, and there's been a lot of overdoses. And so it was actually, when that first started to happen, they looked at it from an epidemiology standpoint and figured out what was going on, and then employed telemedicine actually to consult and help treat some of these patients, because there's only 4 tertiary level hospitals throughout all of the camps serving about 1 million people. And so those providers didn't have access to emergency or response resources, so they were calling into experts actually in the US who could help them through that. And then there's the option of clinical consultation, so specialized expert care. This is the picture doesn't tell you what this patient has, but this guy actually has MDR-TB, and no, he's not wearing a mask. But this patient was waiting for his call to actually talk to a specialist in the US, and he continues to come back and get his treatment. And the device, actually, he can see him, and it's this young lady in the picture. They've hired a telemedicine implementing physician. So she basically just runs the telemedicine device. She does the assessment. She helps move and maneuver everything in collaboration with the provider who is on the screen. And this is just an interesting picture because it's a dermatologist looking at a patient who is following up. So it actually has created continuity of care, whereas like many times before, maybe a provider had flown in from wherever, saw the patient, and then would never be back again. But what this also does is creates the option of seeing that patient again and again, and the patients, they do come back. So this is important in terms of these low resource settings and the provision of healthcare, because the idea is that there's the possibility of preventing about 8.6 million deaths a year, which is a lot, by providing access to specialized care and resources. So the idea also is that with everyone that is interested in telehealth coming together and, you know, providing these expertise and consultations, that you can actually transform healthcare that is currently being provided in low resource, low income settings where the options to see providers or receive trainings and other specialized services aren't available. It's really impactful, and it has the ability to offer patients things that they wouldn't normally have. And so, like I said, I'm working with Integral Global and then in partnership with In Touch Health and World Telehealth Initiative. So, thank you. If anyone has questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, we can take questions from all the speakers now. Yes, do we have a microphone?
Dr. Hussain, you have 20 minutes. Please stick to the time.
Yeah. Where is my presentation, please? Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Doctor. It's my appreciation to be here. I am Dr. Hussain Hamoudi, the Director of Baghdad Poisoning Control Center. In fact, from 2008 up to 2015, we have many cases presented, about 60 cases presented to our center. Sometimes might ask, this is the most likely presentation. Alopecia is one of the presentation of thallium poisoning in chronic cases. Sometimes skin hyperpigmentation also occur, but it is not usually start like that. Usually thallium starts in acute stage with after entering to the GIT symptoms, presented with GIT symptoms in acute. Then in second day, after 48 hours, usually presented with painful ascending peripheral neuropathy. With the time, with the course, after a few days, the painful ascending peripheral neuropathy changed slightly and slow progressive into motor neuropathy. So the patient after 1 week or 2 weeks might have numbness and paresthesia, and usually end with paralysis. This is the effect on the lower limb, which is the most likely affected by thallium. Of course, the mechanism of thallium is usually attributed to its analog to potassium ion. I mean, it enters and deceives the cellular membrane instead of potassium because of similar charge and similar size. It enters to the ATPase system, and that illustrates why it is usually affect the hair follicle, because ATPase is responsible for energy production, and this is due to lack of this energy production. Usually the hair is fall, and the epilation usually starts at the 10th up to 3 weeks. 10th days after exposure up to 3 weeks. Sometimes when the amount ingested is so large, it might cross the blood-brain barrier, and the most likely affected oculomotor nerve, the third cranial nerve, and the patient presented with the dropping of upper eyelid. Here there is 2 case study. One of them, the most common, a famous case report that is published all over the world. It is about Al Jawiya Sport Club. When they ingest thallium, which is contaminated with the piece of cake usually introduced to them during the celebration day of that club. Those 2 families, in fact, admitted to the emergency departments of Al-Kindi hospitals. Their complaint was GIT symptoms, but it was fruitless. They didn't manage well. In the 4 days, they admitted to another hospital within the medical city complex, to the Baghdad hospitals. At that time, they asked me to see and examine the patients. On examination, this is a good example of acute thallium poisoning. All of the patients looked terrified, exhausted, diaphoretic, and the child was admitted to the intensive care unit. The member was 6 at that time. Bilateral painful ascending peripheral neuropathy on all of them. They have severe burn, describe their burn as if they are walking on a pen or a hot coal. Yeah, of course, the tendon reflexes was normal. Babinski reflexes and other reflexes was normal at that time. Abdominal reflexes, normal. Ptosis in 2 persons. Yeah, pleuritic chest pain in 1 person, and all of the patient, of course. There's ECG normal and other examination is normal. In fact, this is the questionnaire that I have asked at the time. How many days they were suffering? The answer was 4 days. This is the day 4. What type of food they were shared? Yeah, they said to me, and a cake introduced to them. Who had ingested the largest quantity? Because I want to compare the quantity that had ingested with the clinical presentation. The answer was that one have severe painful ascending neuropathy and ptosis. That means he had ingested a large amount of thallium which crossed the blood-brain barrier. So, differential diagnosis at that time was arsenical compounds and thallium. Botulism also. We sent for a stool culture and bacteriological study to exclude the Clostridium botulinum and Guillain-Barré syndrome. In the second day, we arranged for laboratory workshop. 6 samples were withdrawn from these 5 samples, and another 2 negative samples. All of them were positive, as you see. This is the name, Zainab and Muhammad Rasul. He is the big boss of Al Jawiya Sport Club. This is the thallium test were done in my lab. If it is clear, a pink color test usually appear, which indicate the positive results. Of course, we use dithiazide and sodium potassium tartarate cyanide reagent in this test. Okay. After we finished the diagnosis, the absence of a Prussian blue at that time, and unfortunately, we sent them to another Jordanian hospital. And the guideline management were prescribed at that time. A Prussian blue should be given orally. Hemodialysis should be done for them. potassium infusion, it is controversial. Some of them said that it might exacerbate the neurological symptoms, and some of them mentioned that it might shorten the bedridden of the patients. This is the Prussian blue potassium ferric hexacyanoferrate. This is a case. Another case, please. Yeah. Mustafa Latif, 13 years old male. In fact, presented to the Mansour Pediatric Hospitals. The relevant gave history that he eat hamburger and sweet, and his daughter were died the day after ingestion. Of course, the Ministry of Health and other pediatricians asked for my help at that time. This is the Ministry of Health. This is the examination. All things were normal except sinus tachycardia. The patient looked hallucinated, terrified. Of course, he has painful ascending peripheral neuropathy, but no alopecia. And with dark hyperpigmentation of both hand and face. This is an abnormal, but it rarely happened with thallium. In more than 80 cases, just we have 2 patients presented with such dark hyperpigmentation. Of course, the patient treated with thallium, with the Prussian blue, and also we add, this is laboratory finding. All biochemical tests were normal, except thallium. The patient has hypertensive, which were treated by captopril, in addition to Prussian blue, or IV fluid, or potassium, of course, given IV infusion, but then it replaced by fruit juice in order to replace the thallium. Usually the patient have hypokalemia during the course of illness. On 7 days, another test were done, which was negative, but the patient kept on the same treatment for at least 3 days. This is this patient presented 1 month after exposure. We add on discharge neurobin, multivitamins, and zinc sulfate. After 1 month, the patient completely returned to normal, but he still has painful, some pain in the lower limb. But it usually, according to the literature, it might disappear after 1 year at least, 9 months up to 1 year. Thank you.
Thank you.
If there's any question, please.
Yeah, they're very interesting cases. I just have one question for you.
Yeah.
How did they get, all the cases got
thallium
in food? What was
Yeah.
the intention
It is
and how did they get that?
Most likely criminal.
Criminal.
Yeah. Because during the wartime, and ISIS, some members, some families, some of their family members belong to ISIS, they might to kill other, which belong to policemen or governments.
And is thallium available?
Yeah, it is not available on the markets, but it is used as a rodenticide in the neighboring countries, in Syria and Iran.
Okay.
So it was used by intelligences during the time before war, before 2003, by Saddam regime to assassinate the others.
Okay, so that's very interesting because I personally have no experience. I would have maybe thought of ascending paralysis, neuropathy, arsenic, which you mentioned, but the alopecia.
Arsenic was negative in our test, in my lab test.
Any other questions?
Any other question, please?
If there are none, thank you very much,
Thanks,
Professor
Salah.
Hussain, and I must give him a big round of applause. I must thank all the speakers, Paul, Chuck, Hussain, and Dr. Abdul Qadir for a wonderful session. With that, we conclude today's day, and we meet again tomorrow morning at 7:30. Thank you very much.
The commonest source of CO poisoning in Turkey?
In Turkey, there is furnaces and heat stoves, most of the common cause. We don't have that much suicidal carbon monoxide poisonings. Big majority of the cases are accidental poisonings because of like I said, furnaces or heat stoves. But we don't have the exact data, so it's anecdotal data.
Any problem with using the hyperbaric oxygen therapy? Is it easy to send the patient there?
Yeah, we have we have several centers in Istanbul, and I'm speaking for Istanbul. So if you had a patient with carbon monoxide poisoning and you think that he or she needed hyperbaric oxygen treatment, you can connect with hyperbaric chamber doctors, and they gladly accept it. But in some outbreaks, we have some delays for treatment because of the patient overload.
Any other question?
Yes. She will talk about caustic injection. Dr. Betül Başaran, she graduated from Hacettepe University Faculty of Medicine and certified as an anesthesiologist from the same faculty, Department of Anesthesiology and Reanimation. Dr. Başaran is an associated professor of anesthesiology and currently working in Konya Training and Research Hospital. She is interested in critical care and toxicology. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, my colleagues. It's my pleasure to be with you as an anesthesiologist. And I come from Konya, the city of Rumi, that's located at the center of Anatolia. Okay, pardon. You see? I declare that I have no conflict of interest about my speech. My topic is corrosive ingestion. As you know, it is rare and potentially devastating event, and there is limited experience, personal experience about it. Uncertainty persists about the best clinical practice, and wide range of cases can be seen from the mild to severe, and the CT scan is accepted as a best methodology for the management of the cases according to worldwide scientific literature. And esophageal stricture, as you may know, is the main common consequence. During the management of these cases, multidisciplinary approach is accepted. And you may see what clinicians must be participate to manage these cases. I am the anesthesiologist, the second one. And the first one always is the emergency care physicians. And, pardon. As you may know, two age groups are most risky group. First one is children aged between the 2 and 6 years. I think about 80% of the cases are children between 2 and 6 years, and 20% of cases are adult. They are aged between the 30 and 40 years. And two main agents responsible for the caustic ingestion strictures, caustic ingestion burns. And the first one is the strong acid. Strong acid may cause coagulative necrosis, esophageal scar formation, and also strong acid can cause prolonged gastric contact. The second one is alkali. and alkali can cause the cofactive necrosis, but the difference from the acid is the alkalis can cause in all the GI tracts, can affect all the GI tracts. It's the difference from the strong acids. Major determinant of the outcome, as you may guess, is the quantity. Early contact of the poison control center is must. Why must? Systemic effects of the corrosive agents can affect the medical situation of the patient. As you may see, hypocalcemia, hyponatremia, hypokalemia, and acidosis are seen in these patients. And as you may guess, the pathological changes seen in all the gastrointestinal tract, especially in the esophagus. If we mention about the management strategies, primary aim of this management strategy should be the survival, and secondary aims are to prevent early complications, to prevent late sequelae, also to provide nutritional anatomy and quality of life. Pardon. And I want to mention about the initial approach because I know that especially in the initial approach times you are the emergency physicians include these cases. Identification of the corrosive agent is most important. Time from the ingestion must be questioned and the evaluation of the context must be asked to patient, whether it is accident or intentional. Co-ingestion of the drugs must be questioned, and additional risk factors related to patients must be asked to the patients or the nearest. We should make some maneuvers according to increase the esophageal passage, but we should not make to attempt neutralize the pH of the caustic ingestion. The effectiveness of nasogastric tubes controversial. Some scientific data try to use it, but some not. Some of them not. Evaluation of gastrointestinal injuries. In case of evaluation, distinguishment is most important. And unluckily, signs of the digestive perforation are rare, and according to it, symptoms are not correlate with the signs. So it shows us signs and symptoms. Signs plus symptoms do not show the full necrosis. Some of the patients may be admitted to emergency department with a better condition, but in these patients we can also see the full necrosis of the esophagus or the stomach. In these patients, some of the blood-related parameters can be changed. You may see here. And the second blue one is important for the anesthesiologist because during the perioperative period, we must deal with severe acidosis and renal failure with management of fluids. And esophageal gastrostomy means state of emergency management, but it should be done between the 3 and 48 hours. Later, it's not important at the later cases. Zargar classification used during the flexible gastroendoscopy. You see here the Zargar classification. Endoscopic grading can predict systemic complications, respiratory failure, emergency mortality, also provide nutritional anatomy, but endoscopic grading have two major drawbacks. One of them is inability to predict accurately depth of necrosis, as I said before. The second one is endoscopic grading is mostly observer dependent. And after the 24 and 48 hours, potential disadvantages of misinterpretation can be seen. I want to mostly talk about the computed tomography. It is new data for me, I think. I know before this speech presentation, I know only the endoscopic grading. But during my search about this speech, I learned about the computed tomography, and I learned about that the World Society of Emergency Surgery support application of CT. It surprises to me too much, I think. There are some conflicted data. Some of them related to endoscopic grading is the best. Some of them related to computed tomography grading is the best. But the Lancet supports both of them. The last data from the Lancet also supports, firstly, the computed tomography if needed. If the computed tomography shows us the full thickness necrosis, then the gastroendoscopy should be done. Management algorithms, nearly scientific data supports management algorithms based on computed tomography, as I said before. In all the cases, the computed tomography should be done. After the computed tomography, the related data should be added to gastroendoscopy related data. But computed tomography also has two disadvantages. One of them is renal failure, and the second one is the allergy to contrast agents, as you may know. I want to mention about little information about the emergency surgery. Emergency surgery, you may guess, has high mortality rate, has high morbidity rate. Also, the bad factors that affect patients related to surgery are advanced stage tracheobronchial injuries, emergency esophageal resection, extended resections, and severe derangement of laboratory test results, as I mentioned before. If you look at the surgical procedures, we mostly see in the operating theater the esophagogastrectomy. It is accepted as the most common emergency procedure. The second one is the damage control surgery. In the caustic ingestion, patients can be accepted as a major trauma patients. As you may know, major trauma patients should be dealt as a damage control surgery, not only one-sided surgery. The caustic ingestion patient can be accepted as there.
Please take the sentence.
Efendim?
Take the presentation, finish, please.
Okay. Partial gastric resection is not recommended, and concomitant necrosis of organs can cause extended resections. Non-surgical management, as I mentioned before, from the non-surgical management, early nutritional support is very important, and total parenteral nutrition must be inserted to non-surgical management. Delayed sequelae, as you know, hemorrhage, fistula formation, and malignancy are delayed sequelae. In low resource settings, limited access to medical expertise is seen and poor follow-up seen. In low resource settings, primary aim should be prevention of malnutrition and gastrostomy. And future directions are there: optimal management of corrosive ingestion, quality of life after caustic ingestion, and preventive measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bambasharan. Do you have any question or contribution? Please.
I guess I have a question and a comment. The question is, did you come across any use of steroids and antibiotics in such cases?
Yes, I have read about the steroids and antibiotics, but they have no place during the routine management of cases.
Okay, then
It should be think case by case. In the routine practical cases, they have no place for the steroids or the antibiotics.
yeah, okay. So and then the comment basically is a majority of these injuries that have been related to caustics are will have a very bad outcome despite the measures that you are doing initially, and so preventive measures probably the standard of care. And increase the awareness about how difficult
you are right.
these cases should be addressed in a very confirmative way.
Yes,
Thank
you are right.
Thank you. Other question?
Thank you for your presentation. I want to ask you, I met with lots of causative ingestions in my clinic, and most of the time pediatric surgeons are stopping the oral intake and waiting for 24 hours. So what's your emergency surgery rates for caustic congestion
pediatric
in your,
cases? Yes.
in your hospital?
I have 1 year training period in the pediatric surgery department before the anesthesiology training. And the pediatric surgeons mostly deal with cases with waiting. Not the operating. They wait, not operate. In the Konya Training and Research Hospital, we did not take any pediatric patients for the emergency resection.
Thank you. Other question? Any other question? Thank you very much.
Is going to talk about the colchicine poisoning. Please welcome Dr. Azura Shiki. I'm not sure, I'm sorry if I pronounced it incorrectly.
Azura Kiki.
Kiki,
Yes.
okay. Please welcome Dr. Kiki.
Thank you. Thank you,
And
Chairman.
Dr. Kiki is a medical toxicologist working at the Pavia Poison Control Center in Italy.
Thank you for the presentation, and thank you to the organization to invite me to talk about colchicine poisoning. So let's start talking about colchicine. It's a drug derived from the alkaloid component of the plant Colchicum autumnale. Colchicine binds the tubulin dimer and inhibiting the formation and function of microtubules. So, with consequent anti-inflammatory and antimitotic properties commonly used in therapy for the gouty arthritis or familial Mediterranean fever or other rheumatic disease. It's a poisoning with high mortality rate, and it can occur after intentional overdose, therapeutic errors, or ingestion of plant containing colchicine that are often confused with edible plants. The most widespread in Italy is Colchicum autumnale, often collected instead of wild garlic or Allium ursinum. So to my knowledge, different species of Colchicum are present on the MENA region with a huge variability, and all plants are poisonous with the high concentration of colchicine in bulb, corn, and seeds. And this is an example, the species of Colchicum present in Turkey with difference to autumn and spring. So in order to understand the basis of colchicine poisoning treatment, it is important to point out some toxicokinetic characteristics of colchicine. And the first one, because of the antimitotic action of tubulin, because on the microtubules, because of the presence ubiquitary of the microtubules in cells, of course, colchicine has a really narrow therapeutic index. Is a variable bioavailability between 25 and 50%, a volume of distribution of up to 21 liter per kilo, plasma protein binding between 10 and 50%, is metabolized by liver with biliary secretion and enterohepatic cycle, and with a renal elimination of 20% and elimination half-life variable on renal elimination rate from 10 to 37 hours. So evaluate reliable prognosticator is important to early identify patients at risk of death who should benefit from aggressive treatments. It's therefore important to evaluate the ingested dose because it is known that if patient ingested less than 0.5 milligram per kilo of colchicine, death rate is less than 5%. But if patient ingested more than 0.8 milligram per kilo of colchicine, death rate increased to 90%. Of course, this does not apply with plant ingestion, but only with drugs. So other known prognosticators in colchicine poisoning are prothrombin index less than 20% or white blood cell count more than 80 grams per liter in the first 24 hours, or the onset of cardiogenic shock of ARDS in the first 72 hours. And the exact prognostic value of plasma colchicine concentration is still unknown and I think is not currently available in emergency practice. So, drug-drug interaction may cause clinical picture more severe than predicted when, in example, colchicine is co-ingested with the cytochrome inhibitors 3A4 or PGP inhibitors. And clinical picture of colchicine poisoning is characterized by 3 phases. The first one is called gastroenteric phase, from 2 to 24 hours from ingestion, and is characterized by abdominal pain, vomitus, and diarrhea with consequent volume depletion and peripheral leukocytosis. The phase 2, that is the most dangerous for the patient and is the one in which patient could die because of the onset of cardiovascular shock, respiratory distress, myelosuppression, thrombocytopenia, rhabdomyolysis, and multi-organ failure. If patients survive from this phase, we observe the third phase, that is the recovery phase, with rebound leukocytosis and alopecia. So, based on this information, it is important to identify the key points of the management, especially in the first hour from ED presentation, and I want to start by discussing a case that I consider explicative to this objective. This is the case of a 42-year-old woman for which Pavia Poison Control Center was called from extra-hospital emergency setting, and because the patient had taken 30 minutes before, a dose of 0.85 milligram per kilo of colchicine, so of course a potential lethal dose. So the first indication was perform gastric lavage in the first emergency room available. 1 hour later, the patient arrived in a near emergency hospital, Elitto Hospital of Italy. So the potential severity of the evolution was explained and the importance of the decontamination was underlined, but what happened was that because of the discovery of a pregnancy test positive, the patient was transferred to a bigger hospital with an OB-GYN service, but gastrointestinal decontamination was still not performed. So unfortunately, the patient died on day 5 of hospitalization. Yes, so sad. But I think it's really important because starting from this, I want to focus your attention on the first hour management of colchicine poisoning, in which is important history evaluation, of course, suspect colchicine poisoning, calculate ingested dose, consider drug-drug interaction, start laboratory test monitoring, but mainly is important to perform gastrointestinal decontamination. And as soon as possible after ingestion and after emergency room admission. Gastrointestinal decontamination should be considered even some hours after ingestion, and even if many hours after ingestion if patients co-ingested opioids or other peristalsis inhibitor. So gastrointestinal decontamination should be based on gastric lavage, oral administration of activated charcoal, multiple dose of charcoal because of the enterohepatic cycle, and whole bowel irrigation. So, I made the photo. So the rest of the treatment is mainly based on the phase of the poisoning, is based on is supportive treatment, so fluids in case of vomitus and diarrhea, vasopressor in case of cardiogenic shock, mechanical ventilation in case of ARDS, hemodialysis that is ineffective because of the large volume of distribution, but should be considered if the patient has acute kidney injury, and of course colonial growth factor or transfusions in case of myelosuppression. So other considerations should be made on exceptional treatment, like ECMO. There are reported some cases with favorable outcome, but colchicine poisoning results in multi-organ failure independently from cardiac failure, so actually evidence is still lacking. And the anticorpal fragments anti-colchicine that are still unavailable. So in conclusions, colchicine poisoning is characterized by high mortality rate, should be considered if patients came to emergency room with the gastrointestinal symptom after ingestion of self-collected plants. It's important to evaluate early known prognosticator to early identify patients at risk of death. And gastrointestinal decontamination must not be delayed and should be considered also late decontamination if co-ingestion, as I said, of opioids or other peristalsis inhibitor. Consider drug-drug interaction if you see a clinical picture severe more than prognosticated, and treatment is mainly supportive and needs to be aggressive. Thank you.
Any question? Have you had any experience with the ECMO?
Yes and not. Not in Italy. I have experience in France, but unfortunately was a patient with amphora who died, because actually, as I said, ECMO acts on the cardiac failure, but not on acute kidney injury, rhabdomyolysis, and the multi-organ failure. So unfortunately not. But was a patient with late arrival at hospital. Actually, is the most important thing. If patient absorb all colchicine that had taken, the mortality rate is really high.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Chairman of Emergency Department at Hamad Medical Corporation, Qatar. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I know it's late, and I hope everybody still have some power. So it is basic, so it will not be a lot of information there. But let's see if we can get some benefit from it. So first of all, let me ask anyone from the audience, how many cases of methemoglobin you diagnosed in the last year? So anybody diagnosed methemoglobin in the last 1 year? By raising hand? So nobody. So that means it's rare disease. That's making my life easy. Okay. So I'm talking now about methemoglobinemia. I don't have anything to disclose. We'll talk about what is methemoglobinemia and what is the most common agent that induce methemoglobin in the blood and information. And if there is any doubt, how we treat it, how the presentation, we'll go through that in very brief. So let's start with the case. This is a real case, came to us in Qatar. It's a 27-year-old man who has ingested some chemicals for intentional, for suicidal attempt. He brought by ambulance with complaint of dizziness and drowsiness. And the things he ingested was this chemical. It calls indoxacarb. It is non-organophosphate insecticide. It was used there widely for agricultural issues, and he ingested quite a large amount of it for suicidal attempt. So this is the first physical examination of it. He is not tachycardic, blood pressure was fine. Saturation, which was significantly low to 82 to 87% in 100% room air. And he was severely cyanosed, but he was GCS is still okay. So ECG done for him, it was normal. There was no ECG changes. But we found in the lab investigation that his methemoglobin level was 79, which is very, very high. Okay, one of the highest level that diagnosed in our region. Maybe there is one in UK with Dr. Kamor, 91 you got? 90.3. So this is the maximum was diagnosed. Anyway, so this patient is having a very high level of methemoglobin, and he is already symptomatic. He is cyanotic, and he has a dizziness, some headache, tiredness, and he was actually not in the main tertiary hospital. He was in a peripheral hospital. And they started do intubation for him. Then they call a poison center for such case. And we told him, okay, this is a case already you diagnosed. So you start treatment. Okay, so let's have some basics about physiology. This is the hemoglobin, deoxygenated hemoglobin when there is no oxygen. And when there is a binding of oxygen, it binds to it and change it to oxyhemoglobin. With extra oxygen, the bond of oxygen become more tight. Okay, what happens in methemoglobinemia is that there is oxidant that oxidize the iron from ferrous to ferric, and that oxidant form cannot bind the oxygen, it bind the water. And then there will be a formation of functional anemia, where there is enough hemoglobin, enough oxygen, but it's not delivered to the tissue because of this problem. Okay? So the clinical manifestation, as we mentioned, it actually depends on what stage or what is the percentage of methemoglobin. It can come with chocolate cyanosis, chocolate colored. Patient may presented with headache, CNS manifestation, sometimes GI upset, dyspnea. It may reach in a high level to a CNS seizure or coma, or sometimes, if not treated well, it may go to a death. Okay, so it depends, as we mentioned, is to the level. Usually the level below 20, no symptoms or very mild cyanosis, and up to 20%, you can see the cyanosis clearly, and patient may have mild symptoms of nausea, some dizziness is there. If it reaches to 50, the cyanosis will become more profound, and the symptoms become more headache, more dizziness, nausea, vomiting, dyspnea, and in severe cases up to 70, it has become with CNS manifestation of seizure, coma, and the cyanosis become more severe, more clear, and more than 70 usually is lethal. So it is a significant problem, so that leads to death. So we need to recognize it. And we need to do some investigation. So usually the color of blood, it is chocolate color. This due to the presence of methemoglobin level very high, and it's actually correlate also with the percentage of methemoglobin in the blood. Okay, ABG usually it has a normal partial oxygen pressure, but the saturation is very low because the saturation machine, it is actually reading the wavelengths of the oxygen in the blood. That's caused something called saturation gap, and that helps us also in diagnosing the methemoglobin. Okay, so then you do for either ABG or VBG, whereas usually in new machines have a methemoglobin level, which is the diagnostic. So basically, usually the patient with an exposure to the forming agent of methemoglobin, plus the clinical presentation, that will give you a clear clue what is going on. Methemoglobin causes usually either a congenital, like this cytochrome B deficiency or reductase deficiency, whereas actually the reduction of methemoglobin to the normal hemoglobin, and this is usually the a mechanism of action because in the body there is a usual up to 1% production of methemoglobin on normal basis. And this mechanism will reduce the methemoglobin level in the blood if there is no agent that increase the dose of methemoglobin. Okay, so acquired is a very long list of medications, chemicals, and a lot of things. And you can see dapsone is one of the most common anti-malaria. We treated methemoglobin with amyl nitrate, and amyl nitrate can cause methemoglobinemia also. And there is, which is a well-known nitrate, which we are using for chest pain and other things. It can cause, and anything with nitrogen and nitrate can cause methemoglobinemia, like a fire, smoke inhalation. So not only CO poisoning, but it can also comes with methemoglobinemia. So as we mentioned, the treatment is simple and is gold standard, methylene blue. Methylene blue is antidote of methemoglobinemia. And it can use for other uses also, and we put the methemoglobinemia down in the list. Okay, so the pharmacokinetics, the maximum effect is up to 30 minutes. If we use it in small doses, we get our reflex of oxidizing agent to hemoglobin again, but if we are using it in high concentration, we actually producing methemoglobin again. So elimination by bile, feces, and urine. So what is the dosage? And when we use it usually in very high concentration, more than 20, and in the patient is symptomatic. So we give it in a dose 1 to 2 milligram per kg over 5 minutes, slow infusion. Okay, and till the cyanosis is resolved, usually within 30 minutes. But this is not the final point we are looking for. It's actually we repeat the level, okay, and we see it's actually dropping down, okay. So caution in G6PD, because methemoglobinemia in G6PD patient can cause hemolysis. So if there is a need, real need, then we need to use it with caution, with very small dose of 1 milligram per kg only. And we keep rechecking methemoglobin and hemolysis pictures, okay? And the side effects, as I mentioned, is according to the dose, how much we are giving. Okay, back to our cases, we give 2 milligram per kg for him, and the cyanosis and the clinical improvement was so fast, within 20 minutes. Patient was intubated in the second day, and he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital because of his suicidal attempt. By this, I conclude my lecture, and happy to receive any question.
Any question? No? Because we are running out of time, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next presenter, medical toxicologist and also board certified in emergency medicine. He also obtained postgraduate diploma in medical toxicology from Cardiff University in the United Kingdom. Please welcome Dr. Walid. Dr. Awad.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. We're gonna go within the coming 10 minutes fast through this subject, which is the aluminum phosphate. I think they put it, the moderators and the organizer, they put it in this session because they know the severity of this substance. I don't have anything to disclose. We're gonna go in this lecture through the background, the epidemiology, the toxodynamic, the clinical presentation, the diagnostic workup, and the management. First of all, aluminum phosphate is one of the fumigants, which is non-specific pesticides applied to kill and control rodents, insects, weed seeds, and fungi anywhere in the soil, structures, crops, and grains. And it have different chemicals, physicals, and mechanism of toxicity. Aluminum phosphate is the most common one. It have different metals. It's, the most common is the aluminum, but there is zinc, magnesium, and calcium. It is, as we said, used for protect grains held in soils, ships, and during the transportation. because of its low cost and high effectiveness, freedom from toxic residues, and lack of adverse effect on the seed's viability. That's why they use it widely. In the last 35 years, the cases of aluminum phosphate increase dramatically, and this is mainly because of the advanced transportation and manufacturing of this substance, as well as start to be used as a suicidal substance for suicidal purpose. It is very common in agricultural society, India, Sri Lanka, Iran, Jordan, and Morocco in the region. And that's obviously because it is available in that society, and it is less and rare in Europe and North America. Aluminum phosphates, the first picture, it is the most widely available. It is, as it there in the picture, the greenish tablet with the garlic order. And each tablet has 3 grams of aluminum phosphates. And it contains also some ammonium carbamates and urea. The zinc phosphides, as in the second picture, look like dark gray powder or crystal. The odor is like rotten fish. Calcium phosphates, as in the third picture, look like reddish brown powder. Aluminum phosphate, actually, when it is mixed with the moisture, ambient moistures, it will give the phosphine gas, which is the main cause of the toxicity, the cytotoxicity, and which is going to lead to the death later. If it is mixed with water, this will lead to rapid release of the phosphine. And this is significant because mainly in the suicidal attempts, they intend to take water on top of these tablets, and this makes the condition faster and make the severity worse. The mechanism of toxicity it will be through blocking the electron chain transport by inhibiting the cytochrome oxidase and formation of reactive free hydroxyl radicals and reduce the glutathione. This will result into lipid peroxidations, protein denitrations of the cell's membrane, and interfere with the enzymatic function and synthesis of protein. It also causes acute respiratory distress syndrome through direct injury to the alveolar capillary membranes and by producing oxidative injury. It also have effect and inhibit the cholinesterase activities, but this not to the clinical significant level. The toxic dose for the zinc metals, it's around 1 gram, and the death can happen if there is around 4 gram ingestion. For the aluminum phosphates, 500 milligram can be fatal. The smell, the garlic smell, it is very common with aluminum phosphate. So if you smell it in your department, you have to think about aluminum phosphates. The clinical manifestation, it depends on the dose, the route of entry, if it is ingested or inhalated, the time to exposure, how long, especially for the inhalation. And the aluminum phosphate, it have rapid effect than the zinc phosphate. So the zinc phosphate, the symptoms can happen even after 40 minutes. The clinical manifestation, if it is mild, then it will be GI symptoms. It will be around, mainly about the GI symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, discomfort of the abdomen, epigastric, and tachycardia as a result. Moderate to severe symptoms, it will involve multiple systems, the GI, and this even can reach to hepatic failure, cardiovascular, hypotension, palpitation, cardiovascular collapse, and dysarrhythmia. CNS, secondary to the hypoxia, there will be dizziness, confusion, convulsion, and coma. Respiratory, tachypneic, and ARDS. Renal failure, metabolic acidosis, airway irritation, especially in inhalation. The diagnostic test, what is in this slide is usually, actually it measure the complication of this substance into the body, the CBS and the coagulation profile to check for the intravascular hemolysis, methemoglobinemia, and DIC. The chemistry looking for the hypokalemia, hypo and hypermagnesemia, hyper and hypoglycemia, acid-base balance, metabolic acidosis, the main, and there will be also respiratory acidosis and lactic acidosis. Acute kidney injury, we expected in these cases, chest X-ray to check for the ARDS. ECG it is very common to see ECG change in these cases, but it is variable. Tachycardia is the most common and to start with. Then there will be T wave and ST change. Ventricular and atrial tachyarrhythmia is common. Echo to measure the effect on the heart. There will be a dysfunction, dilatation, hypokinesia, and akinesia of the left ventricles. As a toxicologist, we don't recommend to do a specific test for the physogene to measure the phosphine in the blood or in the urine because it is rapidly oxidized, but for some reasons, medico-legally, you may need to do that. The most specific and sensitive test is the gas chromatograph. Also, silver nitrate test can be done through the gastric contained and exhaled breath. Treatment start with decontamination. Inhalation, for inhalation cases, the best is to remove the patient from the source and supply oxygen as needed. For the cutaneous exposure, remove the clothes and try to decontaminate with water. Don't forget the eye. For ingested cases, the best to be done within the first 1 or 2 hours. There is a limited evidence about the activated charcoal, but if it happened within the first 1 hour, then no harm to do it. There is experimentals talk about oral administration of sodium bicarb to prevent the conversion of aluminum phosphate to phosphine. Also, there is a case report suggested using potassium permanganate as an adjuvant to oxidize the phosphine to non-toxic phosphates. Vegetable oils and liquid paraffin in vitro suggested inhibit the conversion of aluminum phosphate to phosphine, and there is also single case report. Secondary contamination, definitely we are recommending everyone to have his precaution, but you have to keep in your mind that the particular mask will not prevent phosphine from reaching to you. And there is studies from India. It showed that the staff, hospital staff there, although they didn't have using their specific precaution, but there is nothing, no positive effect on them. There is no specific antidote for treatment. The main treatment is conservative and supportive treatment till the toxin leave the body. Shouldn't be delayed to confirm the diagnosis. And according to the symptoms, the treatment, the arrhythmia using antiarrhythmic, shock, try to use to be guided by the CVB and wedge pressure. Use vasoactive subagent according to the need, pacemakers and mechanical support according to the need. The ARDS, ventilatory support. Metabolic acidosis, you can use the sodium bicarb, hemodialysis according to the need, and don't forget to correct the electrolytes. Some studied about use of NAC in acetylcysteine. There is experimental in animal, and then human studies show some beneficial. Brodoxime, both the phosphine and aluminum inhibit acetylcholinesterase, as we said earlier, but to a level not significant. Further study needed in this subject. Hyperbaric oxygen, experimental data show that it improves the survival time of rates and poisonous rates, and with no change in the mortality rate. Magnesium sulfates act as a cell membrane stabilizer factor and reduce the incidence of fatal dysarrhythmia. Antioxidant effect and combat with the free radicals, and this is controversial. Hemodialysis to help the effect of the renal failure cases and to clear the acidosis. Insulin and glucose, it is suggested by some investigator because of it, the effect of insulin promote the energy and produce production of carbohydrate and restore the calcium flux, which improve the myocardial contractility. Trimetazidine, this is helping approach the BVCs and bigeminase. This is in case report and act as preserve oxidative metabolism, which need further investigation. Intra-aortic balloon pump to help the pressure. ECMO in circulatory failure, not formally evaluated. And thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Any question? No. I have seen some country recommend using the coconut oil to lavage instead of using like fluid water.
Actually they do it from the local experience, but there is no proven study for that. If it will not help, it will not harm.
I would think so because oil can cause pneumonitis as well if the patient aspirate. Right. Thank you so much.
Is currently working as emergency medicine consultant in Ankara University Faculty of Medicine, Department of Emergency Medicine. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will thank the organizing committee and scientific committee for the great conference. I will talk about methanol poisoning for the golden hour management in the ED. Methanol, also known as wood alcohol, is a commonly used solvent in various solutions. But in Turkey, we see methanol in imitated labeled alcohol. A commonly used organic solvent contains in perfumes, photocopic fluid, windshield washing fluid, and perfumes also. Methanol is a component of the many industrial solvents and poorly adulterated alcoholic beverages. Methanol poisoning is a common problem worldwide, especially in the lower socioeconomical countries, and methanol may cause outbreaks. Methanol is relatively low toxic, but metabolism is formic acid is a toxic. First, upon ingestion, methanol absorbed in the gastrointestinal tract rapidly, then metabolized in the liver. First, methanol transformed the formaldehyde with enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase is a slow reaction. Then formaldehyde transformed to formic acid with enzyme aldehyde dehydrogenase, and lastly, formic acid oxidized to carbon dioxide and hydrogen, presence of cofactor tetrahydrofolate. Last enzyme, formic acid to the carbon dioxide to the hydrogen, carbon dioxide and water, a very slow reaction. So in methanol toxicity, formic acid accumulates and causes metabolic acidosis. Who is at risk? Children. Accidentally overdoses of any solvents containing perfume, windshield washing fluid. Suicide attempts with methanol is uncommon. Methanol toxicity may be seen in alcoholic persons. Alcoholic persons consume methanol as a substitute for ethanol. And developing countries like ours, imitated labeled alcohol or homemade alcohol may cause methanol poisoning. In a recently publication from our clinic, an ingestion is very, very high. But in this case report, we report a transdermal methanol intoxication. 58-year-old woman presented to emergency medicine with dizziness, diplopia, nausea, vomiting. She uses a methanol-containing solution for knee pain. In Turkey, we say that reşo yağı and fluid for food heater. We treated this patient with ethanol, sodium bicarbonate, and hemodialysis, and completely resoluted. No sequelae. Initial symptoms of methanol intoxication generally occur after ingestion of 12 and 24 hours later. This latency is due to enzymatic reaction and may be affected with concomitant and ethanol ingestion and volume of methanol ingestion. Methanol blood peak levels 30 to 90 minutes after following ingestions. Initially, methanol toxicity manifests like ethanol toxicity, inebriation, ataxia, disinhibition. Following a latent period, patient may develop headache, nausea, vomiting, epigastric pain. At later stage, drowsiness to augmentation and coma may occur. Seizures may occur due to metabolic derangements and brain injury. Blindness is a very well-known complication of the methanol toxicity. Vision loss is due to formic acid. First, we see flashes of light and blurring, and then scatomata and complex loss of vision may be seen. When we think about methanol toxicity, any patient with any causes altered mental status with acidosis, we think methanol toxicity, ethylene glycol intoxication, cocaine poisoning, inhalant poisoning, complex partial seizures, carbon monoxide poisoning, in keeping in mind these patients. Basic workup includes finger stick glucose, acetaminophen salicylate levels, electrocardiogram, pregnancy test. Electrocardiogram is important for the toxic alcohols. Ethylene glycol causes QT prolongation, and methanol does not. Specific workups are arterial blood gases, electrolytes and anion gap, BUN creatinine, serum ethanol level, serum osmolarity, methanol, ethylene glycol, and isopropyl alcohol levels, if available, and pancreatic enzyme. Methanol toxicity can cause hemorrhagic pancreatitis, a very common unreported cases. Serum osmolarity first increase, then decrease, accompanied with increase in anionic gap. Methanol toxicity affects the basal ganglia, primarily putamen. Bilateral putaminal necrosis and varying degree of hemorrhages can be seen in brain CT and brain MRI. This is not specific for the methanol toxicity. Can be seen in stroke and Wilson disease. Prompt medical care is key to avoid complication of methanol toxicity. Also, antitherapy and hemodialysis is key. Supportive care, airway, breathing, circulation is essential. Antidotal therapy with either fomepizole or ethanol must be started as soon as possible, and hemodialysis is the definitive treatment of the methanol toxicity. Early consultation may be needed, especially in nephrology, neurology, ophthalmology, toxicology, and sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate improves metabolic acidosis. Its effect formic acid to the format, conversion formic acid to the format. This may reverse the visual deficits. Format cannot easily damage the retina and optic nerve, but formic acid damages the optic nerve and retina. Dose of sodium bicarbonate is initially 1 to 2 equivalent per kilogram in intravenously bolus. Maintenance dose is 20 to 40 milliequivalent per hour. Antidotes, if available, we prefer fomepizole or ethanol. If unavailable, ethanol. Both of them inhibit the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase. Fomepizole is superior to ethanol because easy to dose, easy to administer, rare side effects. Its disadvantages of the fomepizole is its high cost. Loading dose is 15 milligram per kilogram intravenously. Maintenance dose is 10 milligram per kilogram every 12 hours for 2 days. Ethanol difficult to dose. Frequent testing and infusion adjustment needing, and ethanol irritates veins. Its more limiting effect is sedative and behavioral effects because ethanol inebriates and aspiration risk is rises. Hemodialysis removes both methanol and formic acid. Indications are high onion gap metabolic acidosis, evidence of organ damage, especially visual changes. Cofactor therapy may be outlined. Optimize the non-toxic metabolic pathway for the elimination. Doses is 15 milligram in every 6 hours. Thanks for your attention. Any question?
Thank you, Dr. Young. Any question or Eddie? Okay. We have seen recently in our country ethanol poisoning is an important issue. Ethanol is an important issue. Yeah. Any question?
Hi, thank you. Just on one of your slides, you suggested that the visual defects can be corrected by sodium bicarb. I'm not sure how accurate is this. And the second point, as far as I know, although formic acid being implicated in the visual sequelae of methanol poisoning, it's not fully understood because formaldehyde, which is one of the metabolites of methanol, which end up leading to formic acid, when people get poisoned by formaldehyde, which was more common in the 70s and 80s, they did not get visual defects. So the notion that formic acid is the culprit is, as far as I know, it's not 100% accurate, and also that's applied to the sodium bicarb. I don't know what's if everybody else has any other opinion about
it. Visual deficits is due to formic acid's effect on optic nerve and retina.